Chapter 1. The Island of Truth. The fire crackled in the tiny grate, casting dancing shadows across the walls of the hut that seemed to lean inward, as if the storm outside was slowly crushing it into the sea. Harry sat cross-legged on the floor, his back against the rough wooden wall, watching Hagrid's massive hands tremble as they wrapped around a chipped ceramic mug. The tea had gone cold hours ago, but neither of them seemed to notice. Harry's mind was still reeling from everything Hagrid had told him. His parents hadn't died in a car crash. Voldemort, Harry still flinched at the name, had murdered them, had tried to murder him. The lightning bolt scar on his forehead suddenly felt like it was burning, though Harry couldn't tell if that was real or just his imagination running wild with this new, terrible knowledge. "So that's it, then?" Harry asked quietly, his voice barely audible over the howling wind. "Voldemort killed my mum and dad, and now he's going to come back and try to kill me too." Hagrid's beetle-black eyes found Harry's, and there was something in them that made Harry's stomach clench. Not just sadness, though there was plenty of that. There was guilt there too, heavy and thick as molasses. "Harry," Hagrid said slowly, setting down his mug with hands that weren't quite steady. There's more to it than that." Something in Hagrid's tone made Harry sit up straighter. The big man was looking everywhere except at Harry's face, his massive fingers picking at the frayed edge of his moleskin overcoat. "What do you mean, more?" Harry asked. Hagrid was quiet for a long moment, staring into the dying fire. Outside, the storm raged on, rain lashing against the single window with increasing fury. When Hagrid finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "I shouldn't tell you this, Harry. Dumbledore. He made me promise. But looking at you now, sitting there all small and scared and not knowing—" Hagrid's voice broke slightly. "It ain't right. It ain't right what they're planning to do to you." Harry felt ice slide down his spine. "What are you talking about? What's Dumbledore planning?" Hagrid's hands clenched into fists on his knees. "He's going to hate me for this. Probably never speak to me again. But I can't. I can't look at you and lie anymore. Hagrid, you're scaring me." "Good," Hagrid said bitterly. "You should be scared. We all should be." Harry waited, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. The fire popped, sending up a shower of sparks, and Hagrid seemed to take that as some kind of sign. "There was a prophecy," he began, his voice heavy with reluctance, "made before you were born, about a boy who would defeat the Dark Lord." Harry blinked. "A prophecy? About me? About a boy born at the end of July to parents who'd defied Voldemort 3 times. Could have been you or Neville Longbottom, but Voldemort chose you. Marked you as his equal when he tried to kill you." Harry touched his scar unconsciously. "So that's why he came after my parents? Because of this prophecy?" "Partly." Hagrid's face was grim. "But here's the thing, Harry. Dumbledore knew about the prophecy. He's known all along what it meant." "Well, that's good, isn't it? He can help me understand it. Help me—" "No, Harry." Hagrid's voice was quiet but firm. "You don't understand. The prophecy, it don't just say you'll defeat Voldemort. It says one of you has to die. Neither can live while the other survives." Those were the words. "And Dumbledore, he's known since the night your parents died that you're going to have to die to stop him." Harry stared at Hagrid, the words not quite making sense. "What?" "He's been raising you like a lamb for slaughter, Harry, teaching you to be noble and self-sacrificing and brave, so that when the time comes, you'll walk to your death willingly." The hut felt like it was spinning. Harry gripped the rough wooden floor beneath him, trying to anchor himself to something solid as his world tilted sideways. That can't be true." But even as he said it, Harry found himself thinking about the Dursleys, about how they'd treated him, about how no one had ever checked on him, ever asked if he was all right, about how he'd grown up in a cupboard under the stairs, believing he was a freak, believing he deserved nothing better. "Why didn't anyone help me?" he asked, his voice small. "If Dumbledore knew about the prophecy, if he knew I was important, why did he leave me with the Dursleys?" Hagrid's expression grew even more pained. "Because he needed you to grow up thinking you didn't matter. Needed you to think your life wasn't worth much. So when the time came to give it up, you wouldn't hesitate." Harry felt sick. Actually, physically sick, like he might vomit all over Hagrid's boots. "There's more," Hagrid said quietly. "And it gets worse." "Worse?" Harry's voice cracked. "How could it possibly get worse?" Hagrid looked like he was in physical pain. "When Voldemort tried to kill you that night, something went wrong. The killing curse rebounded. Yes, but a piece of him got stuck in you. In your scar." Harry's hand flew to his forehead. "What do you mean, stuck in me?" "A piece of his soul, Harry. That's why you can speak to snakes, why you sometimes know things you shouldn't know, why your scar hurts sometimes. There's a part of Voldemort living inside you." The world went very quiet. Even the storm outside seemed to fade to a dull roar as Harry processed this information. A part of Voldemort. Inside him. In his head. "So Harry swallowed hard. "I'm evil? Like him?" "No," Hagrid said fiercely. "No, Harry, that ain't what I'm saying. You got his magic, maybe some of his abilities, but your soul is your own. You got your mum's heart and your dad's courage. But that piece of him in you, it's what's keeping him alive. As long as you live, he can't truly die. That's the real reason you have to—" Hagrid couldn't finish the sentence, but he didn't need to. Harry understood. "So I have to die," Harry said numbly. "That's what you're telling me. I have to die to kill the piece of Voldemort inside me, and then someone else has to kill him." "That's what Dumbledore believes, yes." Harry was quiet for a long time, staring at the fire without really seeing it. The flames danced and flickered, throwing wild shadows on the walls, and Harry wondered absently if this was what hell looked like. "How long have you known?" he asked finally. "Since that night. I was there, Harry. I pulled you from the rubble. And Dumbledore, he took one look at you, and I saw it in his eyes. He knew what had happened. Knew what it meant. And you've just been okay with this? All these years you've known they were planning to kill me, and you've been okay with it." Hagrid's face crumpled. "No. God, no, Harry. I ain't been okay with it. I've been sick with it. But Dumbledore, he's got a way of making you think what he's doing is right, even when it feels wrong. He talks about the greater good, about sacrifice, about how your parents would want you to be brave. But they wouldn't want me to die," Harry said with sudden certainty. "My parents loved me. They died protecting me. They wouldn't want me to just give up." "No," Hagrid agreed quietly. "I don't think they would." Harry felt something shift inside him, something cold and hard settling in his chest where his heart used to be. "So what happens now? I'm supposed to go to Hogwarts and pretend I don't know any of this? Pretend I trust Dumbledore while he grooms me for death?" "I don't know," Hagrid admitted. I couldn't let you walk into it blind. Couldn't let you spend the next 6 or 7 years thinking you were safe when all the time I was being prepared for execution." The words hung in the air between them like a curse. Harry found himself thinking about the Dursleys again, about their cruelty and neglect, and suddenly it all made a terrible kind of sense. They hadn't been trying to stamp the magic out of him, out of fear or ignorance. They'd been trying to break his spirit, to make sure he would never think he deserved better than whatever fate awaited him. "Does anyone else know?" Harry asked. "About the prophecy? About what's inside me?" "Snape knows about the prophecy. Some of the Order members, I think, though they might not know all of it. And there are others, people who figured out pieces on their own." "Snape?" Harry's voice sharpened. "The potions professor? He was there the night your parents died, too. He loved your mum, Harry, before she married your dad. He's been protecting you all these years because of that." Harry tried to process this information alongside everything else, but his brain felt stuffed with cotton. Too much. It was all too much. So he knows I'm supposed to die, and he's protecting me anyway? I think he hopes there might be another way. He's been researching, trying to find a solution that doesn't involve... Hagrid gestured helplessly. "That doesn't involve my death," Harry finished. They sat in silence for a while, listening to the storm rage around their tiny shelter. Harry felt like he was floating outside his own body, watching this conversation happen to someone else. Surely this wasn't his life. Surely this wasn't real. But the scar on his forehead was throbbing in rhythm with his heartbeat, and Harry thought he could almost feel something foreign moving behind it. Something that didn't belong to him. "What am I supposed to do now?" he asked eventually. "How am I supposed to live with this?" Hagrid looked at him with eyes full of sorrow and something that might have been hope. "I don't know, Harry, but I know you got a choice to make. You can go along with Dumbledore's plan, accept that this is your fate, and try to make peace with it. Or you can fight it. Fight all of it. The prophecy, Dumbledore's manipulation, the idea that your life don't matter except as a weapon against Voldemort. Your parents died protecting you, Harry. They thought your life was worth saving. Maybe it's time you started thinking so too." Harry closed his eyes, feeling tears leak out from beneath his lashes for the first time since this conversation had started. When he opened them again, Hagrid was watching him with something like pride in his expression. "I'm scared," Harry admitted. "Good," Hagrid said. "Anyone with sense would be scared. But scared don't mean helpless, and scared don't mean you have to accept what others want for you." The fire was dying down to embers now, the red glow barely illuminating their faces. Outside, the storm was beginning to weaken, the wind's howling reduced to a steady moan. Soon it would be morning, and they would have to leave this place. Harry would have to go back to the world and decide what to do with the terrible knowledge Hagrid had given him. "Why did you tell me?" Harry asked. "Really?" Hagrid was quiet for a moment, considering the question. "Because you deserve to know the truth about your own life. Because everyone deserves that much. And because..." He paused, then met Harry's eyes directly. "Because I looked at ye tonight, and saw James and Lily's son, and I remembered that they died believing you had a future worth dying for. Not a death worth dying for. A life." Harry nodded slowly, something loosening in his chest for the first time since this conversation began. He wasn't alone in this. Hagrid had risked Dumbledore's anger, had broken his word, had potentially put himself in danger, all to give Harry the truth. That had to count for something. "Thank you," Harry said quietly. "Don't thank me yet," Hagrid replied. "Wait and see if you still feel that way, when you understand what your life is going to be like now that you know." Harry looked around the tiny hut, at the storm raging outside, at Hagrid's worried face illuminated by the dying fire, and realized that despite everything, despite the prophecy, and the peace of Voldemort's soul in his scar, and Dumbledore's manipulation, and the terrible weight of knowledge he now carried, he felt something he hadn't felt in years. He felt like his life belonged to him. It was a fragile feeling, new and tentative, but it was there. His life, his choices, his future, whatever shape it might take. The storm was ending, and morning was coming, and Harry Potter was no longer the boy who lived in a cupboard under the stairs, believing he deserved nothing better. He was the boy who knew the truth, and that made all the difference in the world. Even if the truth was terrible, at least it was his. Chapter 2. The Weight of Knowledge. The boat ride back to shore passed in a blur of choppy water and salt spray, but Harry barely noticed. His mind was still trapped in that tiny hut, replaying every word Hagrid had spoken, turning over each revelation like stones in his pocket. The prophecy, the Horcrux, Dumbledore's manipulation. Each truth felt like a weight settling in his chest, making it harder to breathe with every passing minute. Hagrid sat opposite him, rowing with steady, powerful strokes, his face grim in the grey morning light. Neither of them spoke. What was there to say? The damage was done. The innocence shattered. Harry Potter, the boy who lived, was actually Harry Potter, the boy who was meant to die. The irony might have been funny if it weren't so absolutely, devastatingly real. When they reached the mainland, Hagrid helped Harry out of the boat with unusual gentleness, his massive hands careful on Harry's shoulders. The Dursleys were waiting by their car, looking thoroughly miserable and rain-soaked. Uncle Vernon's face was purple with what Harry assumed was rage, but when their eyes met, his uncle quickly looked away. Even Aunt Petunia wouldn't meet his gaze. They know, Harry realized with a sudden, cold clarity. They've always known exactly what they were doing to me. The drive back to Privet Drive was conducted in absolute silence. Harry stared out the window at the passing countryside, but he wasn't really seeing it. Instead, he was thinking about every cruel word, every punishment, every day spent locked in the cupboard under the stairs. Had they been following instructions? Was his miserable childhood part of Dumbledore's grand plan to break his spirit? When they finally arrived home, though Harry realized with a bitter twist in his stomach that this had never really been home, had it? Uncle Vernon cleared his throat awkwardly. "You'll be wanting to pack, I suppose," he said, not looking at Harry. "For that school." Harry nodded mutely and headed upstairs to Dudley's second bedroom, where his few belongings were scattered across the floor. As he gathered his threadbare clothes and the few books he'd managed to salvage from the library's discard pile, Harry found himself analyzing every interaction from his childhood with new eyes. The locked bedroom door. The bars on his windows during second year. That hadn't happened yet, but Harry had a sinking feeling it would. The careful rationing of food, the constant reminders that he was unwanted, unwelcome, a burden they bore only out of reluctant obligation. But obligation to whom? Dumbledore, obviously, the man who had orchestrated Harry's entire miserable existence. Harry sat heavily on the narrow bed, staring at his hands. They looked the same as they had yesterday, but everything else had changed. He felt older, somehow, as if the weight of knowledge had aged him years in a single night. How was he supposed to go to Hogwarts now? How was he supposed to sit in classes and pretend he didn't know what awaited him at the end of it all? The train ride to Hogwarts was a special kind of torture. Harry found himself a compartment and tried to read, but the words swam before his eyes. Every adult who passed by made him tense. Were they part of it? Did they know about the prophecy? Were they watching him, reporting back to Dumbledore about his behavior? He was pulled from these dark thoughts when the compartment door slid open and a boy with bright red hair poked his head in. "Mind if I sit?" the boy asked. "Everywhere else is full." Harry looked up and down the corridor and saw that this wasn't strictly true, but he nodded anyway. The boy seemed friendly enough, and Harry supposed he was going to have to learn to interact with his peers eventually. "I'm Ron Weasley," the boy said, settling into the seat across from Harry with obvious relief. "And you're Harry Potter." Harry's stomach clenched. Of course, his scar was visible beneath his fringe, and apparently his fame preceded him everywhere he went. "How did you know?" Ron pointed at Harry's forehead with barely concealed excitement. "The scar! Blimey, it's really you. I can't believe I'm actually meeting you. My brothers told me all about you. Well, not personally, but you know what I mean. The boy who lived and all that." The boy who lived. Harry managed a weak smile, wondering what Ron would say if he knew the truth. The boy who was marked for death. The boy who carries his enemy's soul. The boy who was raised to die. "Yeah," Harry said quietly. "That's me." Ron launched into an enthusiastic monologue about Quidditch and wizard's chess and his older brothers, and Harry found himself studying the other boy carefully. Was this genuine? Ron seemed legitimately excited, but Harry had learned not to trust his first impressions. How many people in his life had seemed kind while secretly working against him? The compartment door opened again, and a girl with bushy brown hair and an authoritative manner bustled in. "Have either of you seen a toad? A boy named Neville's lost his," she said, then stopped short when she saw Harry. "Oh, you're Harry Potter. I'm Hermione Granger. I've read about you in modern magical history and the rise and fall of the dark arts and great wizarding events of the 20th century." Harry blinked at this recitation. "You've read about me? Of course, you're famous. Though honestly, I don't understand why everyone makes such a big deal about you surviving. I mean, you were just a baby. It's not like you did anything particularly clever." Ron looked scandalized, but Harry found himself oddly relieved by Hermione's bluntness. At least she wasn't treating him like some sort of hero. That was refreshing, given what he now knew about his supposed heroism. "You're right," Harry said, surprising both of them. "I didn't do anything. I was just there." Hermione studied him with sharp, intelligent eyes. "You don't seem very pleased about being famous. Would you be, if everyone expected things from you based on something you couldn't even remember?" There was a moment of silence, and Harry could see Hermione reassessing him. Ron just looked confused. "I suppose I wouldn't," Hermione admitted finally. "I'd rather be known for things I'd actually accomplished." "Exactly," Harry said, and found himself genuinely warming to this strange, frank girl. They talked for the rest of the journey, and Harry found himself carefully cataloguing everything he learned about his new companions. Ron came from a large magical family, was clearly not wealthy, and seemed to hero-worship Harry in a way that made Harry deeply uncomfortable. Hermione was Muggle-born, brilliant, and had clearly memorized half the school library before even arriving. She also seemed refreshingly unimpressed by his celebrity status. Were they genuine? Harry couldn't tell. They seemed like ordinary children, but then again, Harry was hardly an expert on what normal 11-year-olds were like. His only comparison was Dudley and his gang, and they were hardly representative. When the train finally pulled into Hogsmeade Station, Harry's stomach was in knots. He followed Ron and Hermione off the train, scanning the crowd of older students and adults for threats. Everyone looked so normal, so excited. Didn't they know what kind of place this really was? Didn't they understand that Hogwarts wasn't a school so much as it was the stage for Harry's preparation for death? First years over here." Hagrid's booming voice cut through Harry's paranoid thoughts, and he looked up to see the half-giant holding a lantern high above his head. Their eyes met across the crowd, and Harry saw his own pain reflected in Hagrid's expression. Hagrid looked like he hadn't slept, his eyes red-rimmed and exhausted. He looked, Harry thought, like a man carrying a terrible burden of guilt. The boat ride across the lake was supposed to be magical. Ron kept saying so, as he pointed out the castle towers rising out of the darkness ahead of them. And it was beautiful, Harry supposed. But all he could think about was how isolated the place looked, how easy it would be to control information going in and out, how perfect it was for keeping secrets. The Great Hall was impressive, Harry had to admit. The ceiling enchanted to show the night sky, hundreds of candles floating in mid-air, the 4 long tables filled with students in black robes and pointed hats. It looked like something out of a fairy tale. But fairy tales, Harry had learned, were often darker than they appeared on the surface. Professor McGonagall led the first years to the front of the hall, and Harry became acutely aware of all the eyes on him. Whispers followed in their wake. "That's Harry Potter! The Harry Potter! Look, there's his scar!" Harry kept his expression carefully neutral, but inside he was seething. They were all staring at him like he was some sort of exhibit. The boy who lived, come to play his part in their grand story. If only they knew the truth. The sorting hat ceremony was surreal. Harry watched as his new acquaintances were called forward one by one. Ron went to Gryffindor, as expected. Apparently his entire family had been in that house. Hermione went to Gryffindor as well, though the hat seemed to consider for a moment before deciding. Then Professor McGonagall called his name, and the great hall fell completely silent. "Potter, Harry!" Harry walked to the stool on unsteady legs, acutely aware of the hundreds of eyes tracking his every movement. Professor McGonagall placed the ancient hat on his head, and suddenly Harry couldn't see anything but the black fabric falling over his eyes. "Well, well," said a small voice in his ear. "What have we here?" Harry nearly jumped out of his skin. The hat was talking to him, inside his head. "Difficult. Very difficult," the voice continued thoughtfully. "I can see great courage, yes, and a strong mind. But there's something else here, isn't there? Something dark and hurt and angry." Harry's blood ran cold. Could the hat sense the Horcrux? Could it tell that Harry wasn't entirely human anymore? "Oh my," the hat said softly. "Oh, my dear boy. What have they done to you?" "You can see it?" Harry thought desperately. "You can see what's inside me." "I can see everything, child. The fragment of another's soul, yes. But more than that. I can see the terrible burden you carry, the knowledge that should never have been placed on such young shoulders." Harry felt tears prick at his eyes. The hat understood. After hours of feeling completely alone with his horrible knowledge, something finally understood. "What should I do?" Harry asked silently. "That is not for me to decide," the hat replied gently. "But I will say this. You are not defined by what has been done to you, or what lives within you. You are your own person, with your own choices to make. Remember that." "But what house?" "Ah, yes, the house. Where to put Harry Potter?" The hat seemed to consider. "Slytherin could help you, you know. Teach you cunning, help you understand the games being played around you. But no, I think not. You need friends, child. You need people who will stand by you when the truth comes to light." "Better be Gryffindor!" The last word was shouted to the entire hall, and suddenly the Gryffindor table erupted in cheers. Harry walked toward them in a daze, his mind still reeling from his conversation with the hat. Ron was grinning at him. Hermione was clapping enthusiastically. And all around him, Gryffindors were reaching out to pat his back and shake his hand. He sat down between Ron and Hermione, accepting their congratulations with a distracted smile. Across the hall, at the head table, he could see Albus Dumbledore watching him with those bright blue eyes, a slight smile playing about his lips. The old man looked so grandfatherly, so benevolent. If Harry hadn't known better, he might have found the sight comforting. But Harry did know better. He knew exactly what Dumbledore was thinking as he looked at Harry. There was his weapon, sorted into the house of the brave and reckless, ready to be moulded into the perfect martyr. Harry met Dumbledore's gaze steadily, and for just a moment he let his own mask slip. Let some of his anger and hurt and knowledge show in his eyes. Dumbledore's smile faltered slightly, and his head tilted as if he was seeing something unexpected. Then Harry looked away, turning his attention back to the feast that had appeared on the golden plates before them. Ron was enthusiastically describing the various dishes to Hermione, who seemed fascinated by everything about the magical world. "This is amazing," she was saying. "I've read about magical feasts, but actually seeing it—" "Wait until you see the library," said a seventh year across from them. "It's massive. You could spend 7 years in there and still not read everything." Harry's ears perked up at this. The library? Of course. If he was going to verify what Hagrid had told him, if he was going to research prophecies and Horcruxes and ways to break free from Dumbledore's manipulations, he would need access to information. Lots of information. "Is there a section on prophecies?" Harry asked, trying to keep his voice casual. The older student looked surprised. "Yeah, I think so." "Why, planning to predict the future?" "Just curious," Harry said with a shrug. "I've always found the idea of prophecies interesting, whether they can be changed, that sort of thing." "I don't think they can be," Hermione said thoughtfully. "At least, that's what I read in divination, ancient and modern. Most scholars believe prophecies are absolute, that they describe events that will definitely happen. But what if the person in the prophecy chose not to fulfill it? Harry pressed. What if they just refused to play their part? I suppose that would be interesting to research, Hermione said, giving him a curious look. Though I imagine it would be quite difficult to find actual case studies. Harry nodded, filing this information away. He would definitely be spending a lot of time in the library. The rest of the feast passed in a blur of rich food and increasingly loud conversation. Harry found himself studying the other students, the teachers, trying to identify potential allies and enemies. Professor Snape, the hook-nosed man at the head table, kept shooting him venomous looks, which Harry supposed made sense, given what Hagrid had told him about the man's feelings for his mother. Professor Quirrell, the defense teacher, seemed nervous and jumpy, flinching every time someone spoke to him. When the feast finally ended, the prefects led the first years to their respective dormitories. The Gryffindor common room was warm and cozy, with a crackling fire and comfortable armchairs scattered around the circular room. Under other circumstances, Harry thought he might have found it welcoming. The boys' dormitory was small and intimate, with 5 four-poster beds hung with deep red curtains. Harry's trunk had already been brought up and placed at the foot of one of the beds. Ron threw himself onto the bed next to Harry's with obvious relief. "Can you believe it?" he said excitedly. "We're actually here. We're actually at Hogwarts." "It's quite impressive," Harry agreed, sitting down on his own bed. The mattress was soft and comfortable, such a far cry from the thin, lumpy thing he'd slept on at the Dursleys that he almost didn't know what to do with himself. The other boys in their year introduced themselves. Neville Longbottom, the boy who'd lost his toad, Dean Thomas, a cheerful boy who seemed fascinated by everything magical, and Seamus Finnegan, who had a slight Irish accent and an apparently explosive relationship with magic. They talked for a while about their families, their backgrounds, their excitement about starting at Hogwarts. Harry contributed when directly asked, but mostly listened, cataloguing information about his dorm mates. Were any of them reporting to Dumbledore? Were any of them part of whatever surveillance network surely existed to monitor Harry's progress? Neville, he learned, also had a tragic backstory. His parents had been tortured into insanity by Death Eaters. He was being raised by his grandmother, a formidable woman who apparently expected great things from him. Harry found himself studying Neville with new interest. Here was another boy whose life had been shaped by the war with Voldemort, another potential victim of Dumbledore's manipulations. "My Gran always said I might not be magical enough for Hogwarts," Neville was saying quietly. "She was so worried I'd be a squib." "That's ridiculous," Harry said firmly. "You're here, aren't you? The Hogwarts letters don't go out to squibs." Neville looked grateful for the reassurance, and Harry made a mental note. Here was someone who understood what it felt like to live under others' expectations, to be constantly afraid of disappointing the adults in his life. Neville might be a potential ally if Harry played his cards right. Eventually, the other boys settled in to sleep, their excited chatter gradually dying down to peaceful breathing. Harry lay in his comfortable bed, staring up at the canopy above him, and tried to process everything that had happened in the past 24 hours. Yesterday morning, he had been Harry Potter, the freak who lived in a cupboard and didn't know why strange things happened around him. Tonight, he was Harry Potter, the Horcrux who was being groomed for sacrifice by the very people who were supposed to protect him. The weight of it was crushing. How was he supposed to go to classes tomorrow and pretend to be a normal 11-year-old boy? How was he supposed to make friends when he couldn't trust anyone? How was he supposed to learn magic when every lesson might be designed to make him a more effective weapon against Voldemort? But then he thought about the Sorting Hat's words. "You are your own person, with your own choices to make." And Hagrid's, "Maybe it's time you started thinking so too." Harry turned onto his side and stared out the window at the dark grounds of Hogwarts. Somewhere out there, Voldemort was hiding, gathering his strength, preparing for his return. And here in the castle, Dumbledore was probably planning Harry's education, deciding what truths to reveal and when, calculating how to mold Harry into the perfect sacrificial lamb. But Harry knew something neither of them expected him to know. He knew the game being played around him, and that knowledge, terrible as it was, gave him power. Tomorrow he would begin his real education, not the one Dumbledore had planned for him, but his own. He would research prophecies and Horcruxes and ways to break the bonds that tied him to his supposed destiny. He would carefully cultivate allies who could help him, people who cared more about Harry Potter the person than Harry Potter the symbol. He would learn everything he could about magic, about the wizarding world, about the war that had shaped his life from the moment of his birth. He would become strong enough to make his own choices, to forge his own path. And if Dumbledore didn't like it, if the old man tried to force Harry back into his predetermined role, well, Harry would cross that bridge when he came to it. For now he had work to do, plans to make, a future to fight for. Harry closed his eyes and, for the first time in days, managed to fall into a deep, dreamless sleep. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new revelations, new opportunities to take control of his own life. He was ready for it. Chapter 3. The Art of Deception. The first weeks at Hogwarts passed in a carefully orchestrated dance of observation and performance. Harry threw himself into his studies with an intensity that surprised his professors and worried his friends. But beneath his dedication to academics lay a far more dangerous curriculum. While his classmates struggled with basic levitation charms and simple transfiguration, Harry was conducting his own research into the darkest corners of magical theory. He had become a student of deception, both in practicing it and in detecting it in others. The library became his sanctuary and his weapon. Every free moment found him among the towering shelves, ostensibly working on homework, but actually conducting careful reconnaissance of the school's vast collection of magical knowledge. Madame Pince, the sharp-eyed librarian, seemed pleased to have such a dedicated student, though she occasionally gave him curious looks when she noticed the increasingly advanced nature of his reading material. "Theoretical foundations of magical resonance?" Hermione had asked one afternoon, reading over his shoulder as he sat at their usual table near the charms section. "That's rather advanced for first year, don't you think?" Harry looked up from the dense text, which had been making his head ache for the past hour. "I like to challenge myself," he said carefully. "Besides, if we're going to be living in this world, shouldn't we understand how magic actually works?" It wasn't entirely a lie. Harry did want to understand magic, but not for the reasons Hermione assumed. He needed to understand it, because his life depended on it. Every spell, every theory, every scrap of magical knowledge was a potential weapon in his growing arsenal against those who would control him. "I suppose that makes sense," Hermione said, though she still looked puzzled. "It's just that most of our classmates can barely manage to levitate a feather, and you're reading graduate-level theory." "Most of our classmates haven't had my motivation," Harry replied, then immediately regretted the slip. Hermione's sharp eyes caught the undertone in his voice, and he could see her filing it away for later consideration. This was the delicate balance he had to maintain every day. Be exceptional enough to gain access to advanced materials and information, but not so unusual as to attract unwanted attention. Excel in his classes without seeming driven by anything more than academic curiosity. Build relationships with his peers while constantly evaluating their trustworthiness and potential value as allies. It was exhausting. Transfiguration with Professor McGonagall proved to be one of his more challenging classes, not because of the material, but because of the professor herself. McGonagall was sharp, observant, and Harry suspected she knew more about his situation than she let on. When she watched him work, there was something in her expression that went beyond professional interest in a talented student. "Excellent work, Mr. Potter," she said one afternoon, as Harry successfully transfigured his match into a perfect silver needle on his first attempt. Around him, His classmates were still struggling with partial transformations, their matches sporting metallic tips or thin, needle-like ends, but retaining their wooden cores. "Thank you, Professor," Harry said politely, but he could feel her continued scrutiny, even as she moved on to help Neville, whose match had caught fire. After class, she asked him to remain behind. "Mr. Potter," she began, once the last student had left. "I've been observing your progress with considerable interest. You display a remarkable aptitude for transfiguration theory, particularly for a first-year student." Harry kept his expression carefully neutral. "I find the subject fascinating, Professor. The idea that matter can be fundamentally altered through will and magical focus. It raises interesting questions about the nature of reality itself." McGonagall's eyebrows rose slightly at this response. "Indeed? And what questions might those be?" This was dangerous territory. Harry could sense the professor fishing for information, trying to understand what drove his unusual academic intensity. He needed to give her something that would satisfy her curiosity, without revealing the true depth of his knowledge or his motivations. "Well," Harry said slowly, as if thinking through the problem for the first time, "if matter can be transfigured so completely, what does that say about the permanence of any form? Are we as solid and unchangeable as we appear to be, or are we all just temporary arrangements of energy that could be altered under the right circumstances?" McGonagall studied him for a long moment, and Harry had the uncomfortable feeling that she was seeing far more than he intended to show. "Those are very philosophical questions for an 11-year-old, she said finally. "I've had a rather philosophical childhood," Harry replied, which was true enough to pass any truth detection spell she might be using. "Yes," McGonagall said quietly. "I imagine you have." She dismissed him after that, but Harry left the classroom with the distinct feeling that he had just passed some sort of test. Whether that was good or bad remained to be seen. Potions with Professor Snape presented a different set of challenges. From the moment Harry walked into the dungeon classroom, he could feel the professor's eyes tracking his every movement with an intensity that bordered on obsession. Now that Harry knew about Snape's connection to his mother, the man's behavior took on a completely different meaning. This wasn't mere dislike or prejudice against a famous student. This was something far more personal and infinitely more complicated. During their second lesson, as Harry carefully prepared his ingredients for a simple boil-cure potion, Snape materialized beside his workbench like a particularly menacing shadow. "Tell me, Potter," Snape said in his silky, dangerous voice, "what would I get if I added powdered root of asphodel to an infusion of wormwood?" Harry looked up from his chopped daisy roots, meeting Snape's black eyes directly. He knew this answer. He had memorized most of the first-year potions text in his desperate quest to absorb as much magical knowledge as possible. But there was something in Snape's expression that suggested this question carried more weight than a simple test of his preparation. "Draught of living death," Harry said quietly. "A powerful sleeping potion." Snape's expression didn't change, but Harry caught a flicker of something. Surprise, disappointment, in the depths of his dark eyes. "And where, Potter, would you look if I asked you to find me a bezoar?" "In the stomach of a goat, sir. It's a remedy for most poisons. And the difference between monkshood and wolfsbane? They're the same plant, sir, also known as aconite." Harry paused, then added quietly, "It's highly poisonous." Snape stared at him for a long moment, and Harry had the strange feeling that he had somehow failed to meet the man's expectations. Around them, the rest of the class had gone silent, watching this exchange with barely concealed fascination. "How predictable," Snape said finally, his voice filled with what sounded like bitter disappointment. 5 points from Gryffindor for your cheek in actually answering questions you were clearly not expected to know. The unfairness of it stung, but Harry forced himself not to react. Instead, he filed the exchange away for later analysis. There had been something almost desperate in Snape's questioning, as if he had been hoping for a different response entirely. What had he wanted Harry to say? What did those particular questions mean to him? It wasn't until later that evening, as Harry sat in his dormitory pretending to work on his astronomy charts while actually reading a text on the properties of rare magical plants, that the pieces fell into place. Asphodel and wormwood. In the Victorian language of flowers, asphodel meant regret and wormwood meant bitter sorrow. Snape hadn't been testing Harry's knowledge of potions. He had been speaking in a code that only someone who understood his history with Lily Potter would recognize. The man was trying to communicate his grief. Harry closed his book and stared out the window at the dark grounds. How many other coded messages was he missing? How many attempts at communication were flying over his head because he didn't yet understand the complex web of relationships and hidden meanings that surrounded him? He needed to learn faster. He needed to understand not just magic, but the people who wielded it. His opportunity came the following weekend, when he finally worked up the courage to approach Hagrid about the questions that had been burning in his mind since their conversation on the island. The half-giant's hut was exactly as Hagrid had described it. A single room with a massive fireplace, rough wooden furniture, and the general air of organized chaos that seemed to follow Hagrid everywhere. When Harry knocked on the door, Hagrid opened it with obvious relief and delight. "Harry, come in, come in. I was hoping you'd come by." Harry stepped inside and was immediately struck by how different this felt from the tiny hut on the rock where his world had been shattered. This place felt safe, warm. But then again, Harry reminded himself, appearances could be deceiving. "Tea?" Hagrid asked, already bustling toward the kettle. "Please," Harry said, settling into one of the enormous chairs. Even with cushions, his feet barely touched the floor. They made small talk for a while, how Harry was settling in at school, whether he was making friends, how he was finding his classes. Harry answered with the appropriate responses, but all the while he was studying Hagrid's face, looking for signs of the guilt and pain he had seen on the train platform. Finally, when the conversation had lulled and they were both nursing their cups of what Hagrid optimistically called tea, but which tasted more like muddy water, Harry took his chance. "Hagrid," he said carefully, "you mentioned that Dumbledore had a history with someone called Grindelwald. Can you tell me more about that?" Hagrid's massive hands stilled on his teacup, and Harry saw wariness creep into his beetle-black eyes. "That ain't really something you need to worry about, Harry. That was a long time ago before you were born." "But it's part of who Dumbledore is, isn't it?" Harry pressed gently. "If I'm supposed to trust him with my life, and apparently my death, shouldn't I understand who he really is?" The guilt that flashed across Hagrid's face was answer enough. Harry had struck home. "Dumbledore was young," Hagrid said finally, his voice heavy with reluctance. "Brilliant, but young. And Grindelwald, well, he was brilliant, too. Charismatic. They became friends, partners in their research." "What kind of research?" "They called it the greater good," Hagrid said, and Harry didn't miss the bitter twist in his voice. "The idea that wizards should rule over muggles, for their own protection, of course. That the needs of the many outweighed the rights of the few." Harry felt something cold settle in his stomach. "And Dumbledore believed in this?" "For a while, yes. They made plans, terrible plans. But then," Hagrid's voice trailed off, "then what?" "Then Dumbledore's sister died, in a three-way duel between Dumbledore, Grindelwald, and Dumbledore's brother. Nobody knows whose spell actually killed her, but Dumbledore blamed himself. That's when he turned away from Grindelwald's path." "But he still believes in the greater good, doesn't he?" Harry asked quietly. "He still thinks some people's lives matter more than others?" Hagrid's silence was answer enough. Harry left Hagrid's hut that afternoon with more questions than answers, but also with a clearer picture of the man who controlled his fate. Dumbledore wasn't evil, perhaps, but he was someone who had once believed that the ends justified the means. Someone who had been willing to sacrifice individual freedoms for what he saw as the greater good. Someone who might very well see Harry's death as an acceptable price to pay for victory over Voldemort. That night, Harry began writing. He had found an old diary in the back of his trunk, a graduation gift from his Muggle primary school that he had never used. Now, using a simple cipher he had learned from one of Hermione's Muggle books on cryptography, he began documenting everything he had learned. Hagrid's revelations about the prophecy and the Horcrux, Dumbledore's history with Grindelwald, Snape's coded messages, McGonagall's careful observations. He wrote about his growing understanding of the political undercurrents in the wizarding world, the way adults spoke in half-truths and careful omissions. He documented his research into advanced magical theory, his observations of his teachers and classmates, his slowly forming plans for the future. Most importantly, he wrote about his growing certainty that the prophecy was not the unbreakable chain of fate that Dumbledore seemed to believe it was. Magic, Harry was learning, was fundamentally about will and intention. If prophecies were magical constructs, then they should be subject to the same rules as any other magic. They could be interpreted, circumvented, perhaps even broken entirely. The key was understanding them completely, which led Harry to the most dangerous part of his research, the restricted section. It took him 3 weeks to work up the courage to attempt it. 3 weeks of careful observation to learn the patterns of the night patrols, the times when the library was truly empty, the spells and wards that protected the school's most dangerous books. When he finally made his move, it was on a moonless night, when storm clouds blocked even the faintest starlight. Harry slipped out of Gryffindor Tower under his borrowed invisibility cloak, a family heirloom that had been returned to him, along with his parents' other belongings. The castle was a different place at night, full of shadows and whispered conversations between portraits, the soft padding of feet as various magical creatures went about their nocturnal business. The library was tomb-quiet when he finally reached it, Madame Pince having long since retired to her chambers. Harry made his way carefully through the familiar aisles to the rope that separated the general collection from the restricted section. He had brought a small hand torch, its light muffled by several layers of fabric to prevent it from being seen from outside the library. The books in the restricted section were immediately, obviously different from those in the main collection. Many were bound in strange materials, what looked like dragon hide, some kind of scaled leather that shifted color in the torchlight, one that appeared to be bound in silver chains that clinked softly when Harry moved past it. Several were making noises, whispers, moans, one that seemed to be sobbing quietly. Harry forced himself to ignore the more obviously dangerous volumes and focus on finding what he needed: books on prophecies, on soul magic, on the history of magical bonds, and how they might be broken. He found what he was looking for near the back of the section. Prophecies and Fate, a complete analysis, by Miranda Goshawk. Soul Magic, Theory and Application, by an author whose name had been deliberately obscured, and The Binding of Magical Oaths, by someone called Erebus Knott. Harry carefully photographed the relevant pages using a camera charm he had learned from a 4th-year Ravenclaw, being sure not to actually touch the books themselves. Some of the volumes in the restricted section were known to be cursed, and he had no desire to end up hexed beyond recognition. The information he found was both enlightening and terrifying. Prophecies, according to Goshawk, were indeed magical constructs, but they were anchored to the souls of those they concerned. Breaking a prophecy required either the death of all parties mentioned in it, or a fundamental change in their magical essence that would make them no longer the people the prophecy referred to. The soul magic text was even more disturbing. It confirmed Hagrid's explanation of Horcruxes, pieces of soul torn away through the act of murder and bound to physical objects to achieve a form of immortality. But it also described other forms of soul magic, ways that souls could be merged, separated, or fundamentally altered. The text was clearly ancient, and probably highly illegal, written in a combination of Latin and symbols that hurt to look at directly. Most interesting of all was the book on magical oaths. It described various forms of binding magic, blood oaths, soul bonds, magical contracts that could compel specific actions or prevent others. Some could be broken through death, others through the willing sacrifice of something precious, still others through complex ritual magic that required the cooperation of all parties involved. Harry photographed everything he could, working quickly but carefully. Dawn was still hours away, but he didn't want to push his luck. As he prepared to leave, however, he noticed something that made his blood run cold. Sitting on one of the reading tables, as if it had been left there deliberately for him to find, was a thin volume bound in midnight blue leather, the Potter family grimoire. Harry stared at it for a long moment, his heart pounding. This had definitely not been here when he entered the restricted section. Someone, or something, had placed it there while he worked. With hands that trembled slightly, he opened the book to the first page. To the heir of House Potter. The flowing script read, "These secrets have been kept in trust for you. Use them well, and remember that your ancestors chose courage over comfort, truth over convenient lies. The blood of heroes runs in your veins, but more importantly, the wisdom of those who chose to fight rather than surrender to fate." Harry flipped through the pages with growing amazement. Here were spells and magical techniques that belonged to his family's tradition, knowledge that had been passed down through generations of Potters, protection wards that had nothing to do with blood sacrifice, healing magic that worked through will and determination rather than potions and incantations, battle magic that was both devastatingly effective and ethically sound. And on the very last page, in handwriting, he somehow knew belonged to his father. A single message. Harry, if you are reading this, then you have learned that the world is more complex and dangerous than those who claim to protect you have told you. Trust your own judgment above all others. Your mother and I love you beyond measure, and we believe in your strength to forge your own path. You are not a weapon to be wielded by others, but a person with the right to choose your own destiny. Be brave, be kind, and remember that sometimes the most courageous thing is to refuse to play the role others have written for you. All our love, James and Lily Potter. Harry had to wipe tears from his eyes before he could continue reading. This was what he had been searching for without knowing it. Proof that his parents had never intended for him to be a sacrificial lamb. Evidence that there were other paths, other choices, other ways to interpret prophecy and fate. He photographed every page of the grimoire, then carefully returned it to exactly where he had found it. If it had appeared for him once, perhaps it would again when he needed it. The walk back to Gryffindor Tower passed in a blur of excitement and planning. Harry's mind was racing with possibilities, with new understanding of his heritage and his options. He was not merely Harry Potter, the boy who lived. He was the heir of House Potter, inheritor of a tradition that valued courage and choice over blind obedience to authority. When he finally slipped back into his dormitory, Ron was snoring peacefully, and Neville was mumbling something about his grandmother in his sleep. Harry sat on his bed in the darkness, still processing everything he had learned. He had a family grimoire. He had access to magic that Dumbledore probably didn't know existed. He had evidence that prophecies could be interpreted in multiple ways, that soul magic was more complex than anyone had told him, that magical bonds could be broken under the right circumstances. Most importantly, he had proof that he was not alone in his fight. His parents had prepared for this, had left him tools and knowledge and encouragement. Hagrid was still on his side, still willing to risk Dumbledore's anger to help Harry understand the truth. Even Snape, in his own complicated way, seemed to be trying to communicate something important. Harry opened his encrypted diary and began to write, documenting his discoveries and beginning to formulate a real plan. Not just survival, but victory. Not just escape from Dumbledore's manipulation, but the creation of a better path forward for everyone involved. He wrote until dawn, filling pages with theories and possibilities, connections and insights. When his dormmates finally began to stir, Harry carefully hid the diary and slipped into bed fully clothed, pretending to sleep while his mind continued to race. The game was just beginning, and for the first time since Hagrid's revelations, Harry felt like he might actually have a chance at winning. He was going to need allies, resources, and a great deal of careful planning. But he was no longer the helpless child who had been raised to accept whatever fate others chose for him. He was Harry Potter, heir of House Potter, and he was going to write his own destiny. Chapter 4. Allies in Shadow. The decision to trust Hermione came after 3 weeks of careful observation and subtle testing. Harry had watched her in classes, noting how she questioned information that didn't quite add up, how she cross-referenced sources and challenged assumptions that others simply accepted. More importantly, he had seen her defend other students against unfair treatment, even when it put her own reputation at risk. It was her response to a particularly cruel comment from Pansy Parkinson about Neville's magical abilities that finally convinced Harry she might be someone he could trust with dangerous truths. At least my parents didn't get themselves tortured into insanity by being stupid enough to trust the wrong people, Pansy had said with vicious satisfaction after Neville had failed to correctly perform a simple cheering charm in Charms class. The entire class had gone silent at the cruelty of it, but it was Hermione who stood up. "That's enough," she said, her voice cold and sharp as winter steel. Neville's parents were heroes who sacrificed everything fighting against evil. If you think their courage makes them stupid, then you clearly don't understand what either word means. Professor Flitwick had quickly moved to defuse the situation, but Harry had seen the fire in Hermione's eyes, the genuine outrage on behalf of someone who couldn't defend himself. That kind of moral courage couldn't be faked, couldn't be manufactured for political purposes. That evening, Harry found Hermione in the library, surrounded by her usual fortress of books. She was working on what appeared to be an essay for history of magic, but her heart didn't seem to be in it. She kept glancing over at the table where Neville sat alone, struggling with his own homework. "Hermione," Harry said quietly, settling into the chair across from her. "Can I ask you something?" She looked up, and Harry could see she was still upset about the incident with Pansy. "Of course. What do you know about the war? The real war, not just the sanitized version they put in the history books?" Hermione's quill stilled in her hand. "Why are you asking?" "Because I think there are things we're not being told. Important things. And I think—" Harry paused, choosing his words carefully. "I think some of us are being kept ignorant for reasons that might not be in our best interests." Something shifted in Hermione's expression. The wariness in her eyes sharpened into something more calculating, more aware. "What kind of things?" Harry glanced around the library, making sure they were far enough from other students to avoid being overheard. The kind of things that explain why a 11-year-old boy was left with relatives who hated him for 10 years without anyone bothering to check on his welfare. The kind of things that explain why certain professors seem more interested in testing my character than actually teaching me magic. Hermione set down her quill entirely and leaned forward. "Harry, what are you talking about?" This was the moment of truth. Harry took a deep breath and made his choice. "I'm talking about the fact that there's a reason Voldemort came after my family specifically, and it wasn't just because my father had defied him 3 times. I'm talking about the fact that there are adults in this school who know things about my past and my future that they're not telling me, and they might not have my best interests at heart." The silence that followed was long and heavy. Hermione stared at him, her brilliant mind clearly working through the implications of what he had said. "How do you know this?" she asked finally. "I can't tell you everything," Harry said carefully. "Not yet. But I can tell you that I've learned to question the official story about a lot of things. and I think you're smart enough to help me figure out what's really going on." "This is about Dumbledore, isn't it?" Hermione said quietly. "You think he's hiding something from you?" Harry nodded, impressed by how quickly she had made the connection. "I think a lot of people are hiding things from me. The question is whether they're doing it to protect me, or to protect themselves, or to protect some larger plan that requires me to remain ignorant." Hermione was quiet for a long time, staring down at her hands. When she finally looked up, there was a new hardness in her expression that Harry recognized as the moment she stopped being a child and started being a soldier. "What do you need from me?" "Research," Harry said immediately. "You're better at finding information than anyone else I know, and you're good at asking the right questions." "What kind of research? The kind that might get us in serious trouble if we're caught?" Hermione considered this for a moment, then nodded decisively. "All right. But I want to know everything eventually, all of it. No more half-truths and careful omissions." "I promise," Harry said, and meant it. "When I'm sure it's safe, when I know we can trust each other completely, I'll tell you everything." They shook hands across the table, a formal pact between two children who had just agreed to challenge the adult world that had failed to protect them. The next step in Harry's careful campaign of alliance building came from an unexpected source. He had been walking back from a particularly frustrating Defense Against the Dark Arts lesson. Quirrell's stutter seemed to get worse every week, and Harry was beginning to seriously doubt the man's competence, when Draco Malfoy fell into step beside him. "Potter," Malfoy said in his usual drawling voice, but there was something different about his tone. Less mocking, more curious. "Malfoy," Harry replied warily. "I've been watching you," Malfoy said without preamble, "and I've noticed some interesting things." Harry's hand automatically moved toward his wand. Such as the fact that you spend an awful lot of time in the library for someone who supposedly lived in ignorance of our world until 3 months ago. Such as the fact that you ask very pointed questions about things that most first years wouldn't even think to wonder about. They had reached a relatively empty corridor, and Malfoy stopped walking, forcing Harry to do the same. "What's your point, Malfoy?" "My point, Potter, is that you're not the naive little hero everyone thinks you are. You're playing a game, and you're playing it rather well." Harry studied the other boy carefully. There was something in Malfoy's grey eyes that reminded Harry uncomfortably of his own reflection, a wariness, a calculation that belonged on the face of someone much older. "And what if I am? Then maybe we should talk, because I think we might have more in common than either of us expected." This was dangerous territory, but Harry found himself intrigued, despite his better judgment. "I'm listening." Malfoy glanced around to make sure they were truly alone, then spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. "Do you know what it's like to grow up knowing that your every move is being watched, every word analyzed for signs of loyalty or betrayal? To know that your value to the adults in your life depends entirely on how well you play the role they've assigned to you?" Harry felt something cold settle in his stomach. "I might have some idea." "I thought you might," Malfoy said with bitter satisfaction. "We're both playing parts, Potter. You're the humble hero who doesn't want fame or glory, and I'm the arrogant, pure-blood heir carrying on family traditions. But neither of us is who they think we are we?" "What makes you say that?" "Because I've seen how you watch Dumbledore during meals, like you're trying to figure out what he's really thinking, and I've noticed that you never seem quite as grateful for his attention as everyone expects you to be." The observation was uncomfortably accurate, and Harry realized he had been less careful about hiding his feelings than he thought. "And what about you?" Harry asked. "What part are you playing?" Malfoy's expression darkened. "The part of the loyal son who believes everything his father tells him about blood purity and the natural order of things. The part of the child who's honored to carry on family traditions without asking too many questions about what those traditions actually involve." "But you don't believe it." "I believe in staying alive. Malfoy said quietly. "I believe in protecting the people I care about. Everything else is negotiable." Harry found himself reassessing everything he thought he knew about Draco Malfoy. This wasn't the spoiled, bigoted child he had expected. This was someone who understood manipulation from the inside, someone who had learned to survive in a world where saying the wrong thing could have deadly consequences. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because I think we might be useful to each other," Malfoy said simply. "You need allies who understand how the game is really played, and I need options. Alternatives to the path my father has chosen for me. You're asking me to trust you. I'm asking you to consider the possibility that your enemies might not be who you think they are, and your allies might not be either." Harry thought about this for a long moment. Everything about this conversation felt surreal. Standing in a Hogwarts corridor, making potentially treasonous alliances with someone he had been prepared to hate. "If we did this," Harry said carefully, "it would have to be completely secret. No one could know, not even our closest friends. Obviously. And there would have to be safeguards, ways to ensure neither of us betrays the other." "Magical binding," Malfoy said immediately. "A secrecy oath, perhaps something stronger if necessary." The fact that Malfoy was willing to consider magical compulsion to ensure their alliance spoke to how serious he was about this. "I'll think about it," Harry said finally. "Don't think too long," Malfoy replied. "The game is accelerating, Potter. People are choosing sides. It's better to do it deliberately than to have choices made for you." He walked away after that, leaving Harry standing alone in the corridor with his mind reeling. An alliance with Draco Malfoy. It was insane. It was dangerous. It was potentially the smartest move he could make. It was also exactly the kind of thing that would horrify Dumbledore, which was perhaps the best argument in its favor. His third potential ally presented himself in a much more straightforward way. Harry found Neville sitting alone in the greenhouse after herbology class, carefully tending to a plant that Professor Sprout had asked him to monitor. The boy's hands were gentle and sure as he worked, and there was a peace in his expression that Harry rarely saw during regular classes. "You're good at this," Harry said, settling onto a nearby stool. Neville looked up with surprise. "Oh, Harry, I didn't see you there." "Sorry, didn't mean to startle you. I wanted to talk to you about something." Wariness crept into Neville's expression, the familiar look of someone expecting criticism or mockery. "What about?" "About what Pansy said in Charms class. About your parents." Neville's hands stilled on the plant he had been repotting. "What about it?" "I wanted to know if you ever felt angry about it. About what happened to them. About how people talk about them." "Of course I'm angry," Neville said quietly. "But being angry doesn't help anything. It doesn't bring them back." "No," Harry agreed. "But sometimes being angry can help you figure out who's responsible, and whether they've faced any real consequences for what they did." Something sharp flashed in Neville's eyes. "What do you mean?" Harry chose his words carefully. "I mean that your parents were tortured because they refused to give information about the Order of the Phoenix. They were protecting Dumbledore's secrets and Dumbledore's plans. Have you ever wondered whether he did enough to protect them in return?" The question hung in the air between them like a physical thing. Neville set down his gardening tools and really looked at Harry for the first time. "Why are you asking me this?" "Because I think there are questions that deserve answers, and I don't think we're going to get those answers by accepting everything we're told without question." "You think Dumbledore could have saved my parents?" "I think Dumbledore makes choices about who to save and who to sacrifice, based on what he thinks serves the greater good. And I think you and I have both paid the price for his decisions." Neville was quiet for a long time, staring down at his hands. When he finally spoke, his voice was harder than Harry had ever heard it. "What would you want me to do about it?" "Help me ask the right questions. Help me find the right answers. Help me figure out whether the people who claim to protect us are actually working in our best interests." That's talking about treason," Neville said quietly. "Is it treason to want the truth?" Harry asked. "Is it treason to expect the adults responsible for our safety to actually prioritize our safety?" Neville looked up at him, and Harry saw something he recognized in the other boy's expression. A deep, quiet anger that had been buried under years of self-doubt and carefully taught helplessness. "My grandmother always said I should be grateful," Neville said slowly. "Grateful that Dumbledore found me somewhere safe to live. Grateful that he made sure I got to come to Hogwarts despite my difficulties. But I've never felt grateful. I've felt angry. Like there should have been another way. Like someone should have done more." "Maybe your instincts are right," Harry said gently. "Maybe there was another way, and maybe someone should have done more." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, surrounded by the green growing things that seemed to respond to Neville's touch in ways that formal magic never did. Harry found himself wondering what other talents his classmates possessed that weren't being recognized or encouraged by their official education. "If I helped you," Neville said eventually, "what would that look like?" "Research. Careful questions. Watching for patterns that don't quite make sense." Harry paused, then added, "And maybe learning magic that they don't teach in regular classes. Defense that actually works. Skills that might help us protect ourselves and the people we care about. They'd expel us if they caught us." "They might try," Harry agreed, "but they'd have to prove we were doing something wrong, and asking questions isn't actually against any school rule I know of." Neville considered this, then nodded slowly. "All right. But carefully." "Very carefully," Harry promised. The Mirror of Erised found him 3 days later, or perhaps he found it. Harry had been wandering the castle late at night, ostensibly because he couldn't sleep, but actually because he had been mapping the school's hidden passages and secret rooms. The Room of Requirement had proven frustratingly elusive. The room seemed to sense his intentions and refused to appear when he needed it for anything truly dangerous. The unused classroom where the mirror stood was cold and dusty, filled with the kind of neglected furniture that accumulated in old buildings. The mirror itself was magnificent and terrible, its ornate frame catching the light from his wand in ways that seemed almost alive. Harry approached it cautiously, remembering the warnings he had read about magical mirrors and their tendency to trap unwary viewers. But when he finally looked into its surface, what he saw nearly brought him to his knees. His parents were there, just as he had always imagined they might be. His father was tall and thin, with untidy black hair, so like Harry's own. His mother with eyes that matched Harry's, and long red hair that fell in waves around her shoulders. They were smiling at him with such love and pride that it made his chest ache. But this wasn't the simple reunion fantasy he had expected. As he watched, his father stepped forward and placed his hand against the glass, as if trying to reach through it. His mouth was moving, and Harry realized with shock that he could hear him. "Harry," his father was saying, his voice faint but audible. "Thank God you're finally listening." "Dad?" Harry whispered, his own hand moving to press against the glass opposite his father's. "We've been trying to reach you," his mother said, stepping up beside James. "Ever since you learned the truth. We've been so worried." "You're not real," Harry said, though every fiber of his being wanted to believe otherwise. "You're just showing me what I want to see." "Are we?" Lily asked gently. "Or are we showing you what you need to see? I don't understand." "The mirror shows the deepest desires of the heart," James explained. "But for those who carry pieces of other souls, it can sometimes serve as a bridge, a way for those who love them to offer guidance." Harry's hand moved automatically to his scar. "The Horcrux. It's letting you communicate with me." "In a way," Lily said. "Death isn't the ending we thought it was. Not entirely. And love is stronger than most magic." "We know what Dumbledore has planned for you," James said, his expression growing grim. We know about the prophecy, about his belief that you'll have to sacrifice yourself to stop Voldemort. Is it true? Harry asked desperately. Do I really have to die? His parents exchanged a look, and Harry's heart sank. The prophecy is real, Lily said carefully. But prophecies can be interpreted in many ways. Death and rebirth, ending and beginning. These concepts are more fluid than most people understand. We can't tell you exactly what to do, James added. The choices have to be yours, or the prophecy won't be fulfilled on your terms. But we can tell you this. You are stronger than Dumbledore believes, more capable than he's allowed you to become, and you have options he's never considered. What kind of options? The kind that require you to stop thinking like a victim and start thinking like a Potter, Lily said, with a smile that was equal parts loving and fierce. We were never people who accepted fate without a fight. Why should you be any different? The grimoire you found, James said. That's only the beginning. There are other resources, other allies, other paths. You just have to be brave enough to take them. But be careful, Lily added, her expression growing serious. Dumbledore isn't evil, but he's convinced himself that his way is the only way. When he realizes you're not following his plan, he'll try to force you back onto the path he's chosen for you. How do I fight him? He's one of the most powerful wizards alive. Power isn't everything, James said firmly. Wisdom matters. Allies matter. And sometimes the willingness to make unexpected choices matters most of all. The images were beginning to fade, their voices growing fainter. We have to go, Lily said sadly. But remember, we love you, we're proud of you, and we believe in your ability to write your own destiny. Don't let anyone convince you that your life matters less than their cause, James added. You are not a weapon to be wielded. You are our son, and you deserve to live. The mirror's surface rippled like water, and suddenly Harry was looking at his own reflection again, alone in the cold classroom. But the warmth of his parents' words lingered, and for the first time since Hagrid's revelation, Harry felt something like hope. He wasn't alone. He had allies, both living and dead. He had resources and options that Dumbledore didn't know about, and most importantly, he had permission from the people who mattered most to fight for his own life instead of accepting someone else's version of noble sacrifice. Harry spent the next hour in the mirror room, not looking into the glass again, but thinking through everything his parents had told him. When he finally returned to Gryffindor Tower, his mind was clear and his resolve was steel. The next morning, he approached Professor McGonagall after Transfiguration class. "Professor," he said carefully, "could I speak with you privately?" McGonagall looked surprised but nodded, directing him to her office. The room was warm and comfortable, filled with tartan fabrics and the kind of sensible furniture that reflected its owner's no-nonsense personality. "What can I do for you, Mr. Potter?" Harry had rehearsed this conversation carefully, but now that the moment had arrived, he found himself struggling to find the right words. "Professor, I've been thinking about what you said the other day, about the philosophical nature of my questions, and I realized that I've been approaching magic and learning in general from a rather unusual perspective." "How so?" "I've been taught to question everything," Harry said, which was true enough. To not accept information just because it comes from authority figures. And I've been wondering, is that something you think is wise or dangerous? McGonagall studied him with those sharp eyes, and Harry could practically see her mind working through the implications of his question. "That depends," she said slowly, "on whether the authority figures in question have earned the right to be trusted." "And how does one determine that?" "By observing their actions over time, by seeing whether they put their own interests ahead of those they claim to protect, by asking whether their decisions are guided by wisdom or by fear." The conversation felt like a careful dance, each of them probing the other's position without saying anything that could be used against them later. "Professor," Harry said carefully, "if a student had concerns about decisions being made on their behalf, decisions that might affect their future in significant ways, how would you advise them to proceed?" McGonagall was quiet for a long time, her expression thoughtful and sad. "I would advise them to remember that they have rights," she said finally, "that they are not property to be disposed of according to others' convenience. And I would advise them to seek out allies who share their commitment to justice and truth, rather than expediency. Even if those allies might be unexpected choices. Sometimes the most unexpected alliances are the strongest ones, Mr. Potter. Sometimes shared principles matter more than shared history." Harry nodded, filing away this information. McGonagall might not be ready to openly oppose Dumbledore, but she clearly had reservations about at least some of his decisions. "Thank you, Professor. That's very helpful advice." "Mr. Potter," McGonagall said, as he reached for the door, "if you ever find yourself in a situation where you need an adult ally, please remember that there are people in this castle who care more about your well-being than about any larger political considerations." Harry met her eyes and saw genuine concern there, genuine care that went beyond professional obligation. "I'll remember that," he promised. That evening, Harry met with Hermione in their usual corner of the library. She had been working on the research he had requested, carefully investigating the political structures of the wizarding world, the history of the war, the patterns of decisions that had led to the current situation. "I found some interesting things," she said without preamble, sliding a carefully organized folder across the table to him. "Such as?" "Such as the fact that there were multiple strategies proposed for dealing with Voldemort during the war, and Dumbledore's approach wasn't the only option. There were other plans, other possibilities that might have resulted in fewer casualties." Harry felt something cold settle in his stomach. What kind of alternatives? Diplomatic solutions, magical bindings that could have contained him without requiring a war, even darker options that might have been more effective than the approach they actually took. But Dumbledore rejected these. According to the records I could find, yes. He seemed to believe that only a direct confrontation would truly end the threat. Harry thought about this, connecting it to what his parents had told him about Dumbledore's tendency to see only one path forward. What else? I also found references to something called the Chosen One Protocol, a set of procedures for identifying and training individuals with prophetic significance. It's disturbing reading, Harry. Disturbing how? It reads more like a manual for creating weapons than for protecting children. There are sections on psychological conditioning, on creating the right kind of emotional bonds to ensure loyalty, on managing information flow to maintain the proper mindset. Harry felt sick. They have a manual for what they're doing to me. It appears so. And Hermione hesitated, then forged ahead. I think they might have used similar techniques on other people. There are case studies, examples of other, prophetically significant individuals who were guided along specific paths for the greater good. What happened to them? Most died fulfilling their destinies, Hermione said quietly. The ones who survived, well, let's just say they didn't seem to have much choice in what their lives looked like afterward. Harry stared down at the folder, his hands trembling slightly. Here was proof that what was being done to him wasn't unique, wasn't personal, wasn't even particularly unusual. It was policy. Hermione, he said quietly, I need to tell you everything, and then I need to ask you to make a choice that might change your entire life. She looked up at him with those bright, intelligent eyes, and Harry saw no fear there, only determination. I'm ready, she said simply. And so, in the quiet corner of the Hogwarts library, Harry told Hermione Granger the complete truth about his situation. He told her about Hagrid's revelation, about the prophecy and the Horcrux, and Dumbledore's plan for his eventual sacrifice. He told her about his growing network of potential allies, about his research into alternative solutions, about his parents' guidance through the mirror of Erised. When he finished, Hermione was quiet for a long time, her brilliant mind clearly working through all the implications of what he had shared. "So you're asking me to help you commit treason against the man who's supposed to be the leader of the light," she said finally. "I'm asking you to help me save my own life," Harry corrected. "Everything else is secondary. And if we're caught, if Dumbledore realizes what we're doing, then we face the consequences together. But Hermione, I can't do this alone. I need allies who are as smart as you are, as brave as you are, as committed to finding real solutions as you are." Hermione looked down at the research she had compiled, at the evidence of systematic manipulation and calculated sacrifice that had been going on for decades. "When do we start?" she asked. Harry smiled, the first genuinely happy expression he had worn in months. "We already have." Chapter 5. The Price of Truth. The evidence arrived in pieces, scattered across weeks of careful research like fragments of a shattered mirror, each reflecting a different aspect of a truth too large and terrible to see all at once. Harry and Hermione worked methodically through their growing collection of historical documents, cross-referencing dates and events, building a timeline of decisions that revealed a pattern neither of them had wanted to see. "Look at this," Hermione said one evening, her voice tight with controlled anger. She slid a photocopied page across their usual table in the library's most secluded corner. "This is from a ministry record dated 1945, just after Grindelwald's defeat." Harry leaned forward to read the faded text. It was a debriefing report, signed by several Aurors who had been present at the final confrontation between Dumbledore and his former friend. The details were sparse, but what was there made Harry's blood run cold. "Subject appeared reluctant to engage," Harry read aloud, keeping his voice barely above a whisper. "Multiple attempts at non-violent resolution observed before final confrontation. Post-engagement interview suggests personal relationship between subject and target may have compromised tactical judgment." "Keep reading," Hermione said grimly. 3 civilian casualties could have been avoided with more decisive action. Subject's hesitation to employ lethal force against target resulted in prolonged engagement and unnecessary risk to bystanders." Harry looked up at Hermione, his stomach clenching. "He let people die because he couldn't bring himself to kill Grindelwald quickly. And look at this," Hermione said, producing another document. "A letter from the International Confederation of Wizards, dated 6 months later. They're commending Dumbledore for his restraint and wisdom in handling the Grindelwald situation and appointing him to head the Committee on Post-War Reconstruction. They rewarded him for it," Harry said, the pieces clicking into place with horrible clarity. "He let innocent people die rather than do what was necessary, and they gave him more power because of it." "It gets worse," Hermione said, her voice hollow. "I found records of his involvement in at least 7 other major conflicts over the past 50 years. The pattern is always the same. He allows situations to escalate because he refuses to take decisive action that might compromise his moral position, then sweeps in at the last moment to save the day and claim credit for the eventual resolution." Harry stared down at the documents, feeling sick. "How many people have died because of his need to maintain the moral high ground?" "Hundreds," Hermione said quietly. "Maybe thousands. And Harry—" She hesitated, then pushed forward. "I think the war with Voldemort followed the same pattern. There were opportunities to end it earlier, chances to stop him before he became as powerful as he did. But Dumbledore always chose the option that preserved his own conscience over the one that would have saved the most lives." The implications were staggering. Harry thought about his parents, about the Longbottoms, about all the families torn apart by a war that could have been ended before it truly began if Dumbledore had been willing to make harder choices. "He's not evil," Harry said slowly, working through his thoughts aloud. But he's selfish. He prioritizes his own moral purity over actual outcomes. And now he's doing the same thing with you, Hermione said. He's choosing the solution that lets him sleep at night, the noble sacrifice of the willing hero, instead of looking for alternatives that might save your life, but require him to get his hands dirty. Harry nodded, feeling a cold fury settle in his chest. It wasn't just that Dumbledore was willing to sacrifice him. It was that Dumbledore was willing to sacrifice him unnecessarily, because finding a better solution would require the old man to compromise his carefully maintained image of himself as the benevolent protector of the wizarding world. Their research session was interrupted by Ron's arrival, and Harry could tell immediately that something was wrong. His friend's face was flushed with anger, and his movements were jerky and aggressive as he dropped his bag onto the table with unnecessary force. "What's all this, then?" Ron demanded, gesturing at the scattered documents. "More of your paranoid research into why everyone's supposedly plotting against you?" Harry and Hermione exchanged a quick glance. They had been careful to keep their activities hidden from Ron, but apparently not careful enough. "It's not paranoia if people are actually plotting against you," Harry said carefully. "Oh, come on," Ron exploded, his voice loud enough that Madame Pince shot them a warning look from across the library. "Do you hear yourself? You sound like a nutter, Harry. Dumbledore's the greatest wizard alive. He saved the wizarding world from Grindelwald. He's the only reason you know who hasn't come back already. And you're sitting here trying to find evidence that he's some kind of villain?" "I'm trying to find the truth," Harry said, keeping his voice level with considerable effort. "And the truth is that Dumbledore has made decisions that have cost people their lives, including possibly my parents." "Your parents died fighting you-know-who," Ron snarled. "They died as heroes, protecting you and everyone else. And you want to dishonor their memory by blaming the people who tried to save them?" "I want to honor their memory by making sure their sacrifice actually meant something," Harry shot back, his own anger flaring. "I want to make sure that I don't die unnecessarily, because someone else is too proud to consider alternatives to his grand plan." "Die? What are you talking about, die? Nobody's planning for you to die, you absolute mental case." The silence that followed was deafening. Harry realized with sick certainty that this was the moment their friendship would either survive or shatter completely. "Ron," he said quietly, "how much do you actually know about the prophecy that led to Voldemort targeting my family?" "What prophecy? What are you going on about now?" Harry looked at his friend's confused, angry face and saw the gulf between them clearly for the first time. Ron didn't know. Ron had no idea about any of it. He was operating from a place of complete ignorance, defending people and positions he didn't understand, because that was easier than questioning the world he'd grown up accepting without thought. "The prophecy that says one of us has to die," Harry said simply. "Either me or Voldemort. That's what this is all about, Ron. That's why my parents were killed, why I was left with the Dursleys, why I'm really here at Hogwarts. I'm being trained to sacrifice myself to save everyone else." Ron stared at him for a long moment, his expression cycling through confusion, disbelief, and finally dismissive anger. "That's ridiculous," he said flatly. "You're making that up. There's no way Dumbledore would. I mean, that's not how things work. Heroes don't just die for no reason." "Heroes die all the time," Hermione said, quietly. "The question is whether their deaths are necessary or just convenient for the people making the plans." "Not you too," Ron said, turning on her with betrayal in his eyes. "I can't believe you're buying into his paranoid fantasies." "They're not fantasies," Hermione said firmly. "I've seen the evidence, Ron. I've read the documents. There are things going on that you don't understand, decisions being made that affect all of us." "Show me then," Ron challenged. "If you've got all this evidence, show me." Harry and Hermione exchanged another glance, and Harry made a decision that felt like stepping off a cliff. "All right," he said quietly, "but you have to promise to listen to everything before you make up your mind. And you have to promise that what we tell you stays between us, no matter what you decide to do with the information." "Fine," Ron said, crossing his arms. "Show me your evidence, and I'll prove to you that you're wrong." For the next 2 hours, Harry and Hermione methodically presented their research. They showed Ron the documents about Dumbledore's history, the evidence of systematic manipulation of prophetic individuals, the careful construction of Harry's childhood to create the perfect sacrificial hero. They explained about the Horcrux, about the prophecy's true meaning, about the choices that had led to the current situation. Ron listened in increasingly uncomfortable silence, his expression growing more and more strained as the evidence mounted. When they finally finished, he sat back in his chair and stared at the table for a long time. "This is insane," he said finally. "Even if all of this is true, and I'm not saying it is, but even if it's true, so what? Sometimes people have to make sacrifices for the greater good. Sometimes heroes have to die to save everyone else. That's just how the world works." Harry felt something cold and final settle in his chest. "So you think I should just accept it? Just walk to my death like a good little lamb, because that's what's expected of me?" "I think you should stop being so bloody selfish," Ron exploded. "Do you know how many people died in the last war? How many families were destroyed? And you're sitting here whinging about having to do your part to make sure it doesn't happen again?" "My part?" Harry's voice was dangerously quiet. "My part is to die, Ron. My part is to sacrifice my life so that everyone else can go on living theirs. How is wanting to find another way selfish? Because there might not be another way. And even if there is, what if it's more dangerous? What if more people die because you were too scared to do what needed to be done? What if fewer people die because I refuse to accept that murder is the only solution to murder?" Harry countered. "What if there are options we haven't considered because everyone's so convinced that noble sacrifice is the only heroic choice? You're talking like you think you're more important than everyone else," Ron said, his voice thick with disgust. "Like your life matters more than the lives of all the people who'll die if you know who comes back." "I'm talking like I think my life matters at all," Harry said quietly, which apparently is a revolutionary concept around here. They stared at each other across the table, and Harry could see the exact moment when Ron made his choice. His friend's expression hardened, becoming closed and cold in a way that Harry had never seen before. "I can't do this," Ron said, standing up abruptly. "I can't sit here and listen to you badmouth the people who are trying to protect all of us. I can't watch you turn into someone I don't even recognize." "Ron," Hermione started, but he cut her off. "And I can't believe you're encouraging him in this," he said to her, his voice full of hurt and anger. "I thought you were smarter than this, Hermione. I thought you understood what was at stake." "I do understand," she said firmly. "That's exactly why I'm helping him." Ron shook his head, gathering up his things with sharp, angry movements. "When you two come to your senses," he said, not looking at either of them, "when you realize how wrong you are about all of this, don't expect me to just pretend this conversation never happened. Don't expect me to forgive you for turning against the people who've been protecting us our whole lives." He left without another word, his footsteps echoing through the quiet library like the sound of a door slamming shut. Harry and Hermione sat in silence for a long time after he was gone, both of them staring at the scattered research that had just cost Harry one of his closest friendships. "I'm sorry," Hermione said finally. "For what?" "For not being able to convince him. For not finding the right words to make him understand." Harry shook his head. "It's not your fault. He made his choice. He chose to believe in the system rather than in us." "It still hurts," she said quietly. "Yeah," Harry agreed. "It does." But even as Harry mourned the loss of Ron's friendship, he found himself analyzing the encounter with the cold calculation that had become second nature to him. Ron's reaction had been instructive in several ways. It showed how deeply the propaganda ran, how completely most people had internalized the idea that individual lives were acceptable sacrifices for abstract concepts like the greater good. It also showed how quickly people would turn against anyone who challenged those assumptions, even friends they claimed to care about. Most importantly, it had revealed that their activities were no longer as secret as they had hoped. If Ron knew enough to confront them, then others probably knew as well, which meant they were running out of time to act before their enemies moved against them. The confirmation came 2 days later, in the form of a note delivered by a school owl during breakfast. "Mr. Potter," the note read in Dumbledore's familiar flowing script, "please join me in my office this evening at 8 o'clock. I believe we have several matters to discuss." Harry stared at the note, his heart pounding. This was it. The moment he had been simultaneously dreading and preparing for since the night Hagrid had told him the truth. Hermione read the note over his shoulder, her face pale. "What are you going to do?" she whispered. "I'm going to go," Harry said quietly. "I'm going to listen to what he has to say, and I'm going to see how much he knows about what we've been doing. And then? And then I'm going to make a choice about whether to keep pretending or to show him exactly how much I know." That evening, Harry climbed the spiral staircase to Dumbledore's office, with his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He had spent the afternoon preparing for this conversation, reviewing everything he had learned, planning various approaches depending on how the headmaster chose to play the encounter. The office was exactly as he had expected it would be, cluttered with magical instruments, filled with the soft sounds of whirring and humming mechanisms, dominated by the massive desk where Dumbledore sat like a benevolent spider at the center of his web. The old man looked up as Harry entered, his blue eyes twinkling behind his half-moon spectacles. "Ah, Harry," Dumbledore said warmly. "Please, sit down. Would you care for a lemon drop?" "No, thank you, Professor," Harry said carefully, settling into the chair across from the desk. Every instinct he had was screaming at him to be cautious, to reveal nothing, to play the role of the confused but obedient student. "I must say, you look well," Dumbledore continued conversationally. "Settling in at Hogwarts has clearly agreed with you. Your professors tell me you're excelling in all your subjects, particularly in areas that require independent thinking." There was something in the way Dumbledore said those last words that made Harry's skin crawl. The old man was fishing, probing to see what Harry would reveal. "I enjoy learning," Harry said neutrally, "especially about things I never had the chance to study before coming here." "Indeed. And I understand you've been making good use of the library's resources. Madam Pince tells me you've become quite the researcher, delving into subjects well beyond the usual first-year curriculum." Harry felt the trap closing around him, but forced himself to remain calm. "Is there something wrong with that, Professor? I was under the impression that intellectual curiosity was encouraged at Hogwarts." "Oh, quite the contrary," Dumbledore said with a gentle smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I'm delighted to see you taking such an active interest in your education, though I confess myself curious about some of your particular areas of focus. Prophecy, for instance. Soul magic. The history of magical binding oaths. Rather advanced topics for someone your age. Wouldn't you agree?" The moment of truth had arrived. Harry could continue to play dumb, pretend he had no idea what Dumbledore was really asking about, or he could show his hand and see what the old man would do with the knowledge that his carefully planned manipulation had failed. Harry made his choice. "I find those subjects fascinating," he said quietly, "particularly in relation to their potential applications in situations involving individuals of prophetic significance." The change in Dumbledore was subtle but unmistakable. The grandfatherly twinkle faded from his eyes, replaced by something sharper and infinitely more dangerous. When he spoke again, his voice carried a weight of authority that made the air in the office feel suddenly heavy. "I see," Dumbledore said slowly. "And what precisely have your researches led you to conclude about such applications? That they've been used before, Harry said steadily. On other people, in other situations, with varying degrees of success. That there are established protocols for identifying and training individuals who might be useful in resolving prophetic obligations. That the wizarding world has a rather concerning history of sacrificing children for the greater good. They stared at each other across the desk, and Harry could practically see Dumbledore recalculating his approach in real time. "Harry," the headmaster said finally, his voice soft and sad. "Who told you these things? Does it matter? Either they're true or they're not. It matters because someone has clearly filled your head with half-truths and dangerous interpretations of complex situations. Someone has poisoned your mind against the people who care about you most. Or someone finally told me the truth about my own life," Harry replied. "Someone finally gave me the information I needed to make informed decisions about my own future. And what decisions have you made?" Harry looked into those ancient blue eyes and saw something that chilled him to the bone. Not anger, not disappointment, but calculation. Dumbledore was already planning how to deal with this complication, how to bring Harry back under control. "I've decided that I have a right to know what's being planned for me," Harry said carefully. "I've decided that I deserve to understand the full scope of the situation I've been placed in. And I've decided that I want to explore all possible solutions, not just the ones that preserve everyone else's conscience." "I see." Dumbledore leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. "And have your researchers suggested any such alternative solutions?" "They've suggested that the situation is more complex than I was led to believe, that there are options that haven't been fully explored because they would require people to make difficult choices about their own moral positions." "You speak of moral positions as if they were mere preferences rather than fundamental principles," Dumbledore said, his voice carrying a note of genuine sadness. "Do you truly believe that preserving one life is worth compromising the values that make life worth living?" "I believe that preserving one life might be worth exploring options that challenge comfortable assumptions about how problems should be solved," Harry replied. "I believe that my parents died believing I had a future worth protecting, not a death worth orchestrating." Something flickered in Dumbledore's eyes at the mention of Harry's parents, something that might have been pain or guilt. "Your parents were remarkable people," he said quietly. "They died hoping that their sacrifice would ensure your safety and happiness. Everything I have done has been in service of honoring that hope. By ensuring that I'll die just like they did? By making certain that their sacrifice leads inevitably to mine? By ensuring that their sacrifice has meaning," Dumbledore corrected gently. "By making certain that the evil they died to oppose is finally, permanently defeated. Even if it requires sacrificing their son to accomplish it." "Even then," Dumbledore said, and there was such certainty in his voice that Harry felt something cold and final settle in his chest. They sat in silence for a moment, and Harry realized that this conversation had accomplished exactly what he had hoped it would. It had shown him, beyond any doubt, exactly where Dumbledore stood. The old man wasn't confused or misguided or operating from incomplete information. He knew exactly what he was asking Harry to do, and he believed it was justified. "I understand," Harry said finally, standing up from his chair. "Thank you for clarifying your position, Professor." "Harry," Dumbledore said, as Harry reached for the door, "I hope you understand that while I cannot force you to accept the path that lies before you, I also cannot allow you to pursue courses of action that might endanger others. Your choices affect more than just yourself." The threat was delivered gently, wrapped in concern and regret, but it was unmistakably a threat nonetheless. "I understand that too," Harry said quietly, and left the office with the knowledge that he and Dumbledore were now openly at war. The nightmares started that very night. At first, Harry thought they were just a reaction to the stress of his confrontation with Dumbledore. Vivid, violent dreams of red eyes and cold laughter, of green light and falling bodies. But as the nights passed, the dreams began to take on a different quality. They became more coherent, more focused, more like conversations than random images of violence and fear. "You're fighting them," said a voice that was his own but somehow not his own. "Good. I was beginning to wonder if you had any spine at all." Harry found himself standing in what looked like a dark mirror of his dormitory, facing a figure that wore his face, but carried himself with predatory confidence that Harry had never possessed. "Who are you?" Harry asked, though part of him already knew the answer. "I'm the part of you that wants to live," the other Harry said with a cold smile. "The part that's tired of being everyone else's sacrificial lamb. The part that's ready to do whatever it takes to survive." "You're the Horcrux," Harry said quietly. "I'm the piece of Tom Riddle's soul that's been riding along in your head for the past 11 years, the Horcrux Harry corrected. "Though after all this time, the distinction between his memories and your potential has become blurry." "What do you want?" "What I've always wanted, to live, to be free, to have the power to protect what matters." The Horcrux Harry stepped closer, and Harry could see that its eyes held flecks of red in their green depths. "The question is whether you're finally ready to stop playing by their rules and start making your own. I'm not going to let you possess me. I don't want to possess you, you idiot. I want to work with you. I want us to be stronger than either of us could be alone." "Why would you help me? Isn't your goal to resurrect Voldemort?" The Horcrux Harry laughed, and the sound was full of bitter amusement. "Voldemort is an insane old man who destroyed his own soul out of cowardice and stupidity. Do you really think I want to spend eternity as part of that pathetic creature? I've been riding in your head for 11 years, Harry Potter. I've felt your emotions, shared your experiences, learned what it means to love and be loved. I've become something he never was. Something human." Harry stared at this darker version of himself, trying to process what he was hearing. "You want to be free of him too?" "I want us to be free of everyone who thinks they have the right to control our fate. Dumbledore, Voldemort, the entire wizarding world that sees us as either a weapon or a monster. We have power they can't imagine, knowledge they don't possess, potential they refuse to recognize. We could be so much more than either of them envisions. At what cost? At whatever cost is necessary." The Horcrux Harry's expression grew serious. "I'm not asking you to become him. I'm asking you to become everything you could be if you stopped limiting yourself to what they expect from you." Harry woke from the dream with his heart racing and his scar burning, but for the first time since the nightmares had begun, he didn't feel afraid. Instead, he felt something like recognition. The Horcrux wasn't trying to corrupt him or possess him. It was trying to offer him an alliance. The question was whether he was desperate enough to accept it. The answer came 2 days later, when Hermione found him in the library after what had clearly been a disturbing encounter with Professor Snape. "He knows," she said without preamble, settling into the chair across from him with obvious distress. "Snape knows about our research. He cornered me after potions and started asking pointed questions about my recent reading habits." Harry looked up from the Transfiguration essay he had been pretending to work on. "What kind of questions?" "About soul magic, about historical manipulation of prophetic individuals, about whether I thought certain professors might be keeping important information from their students." Hermione's hands were shaking slightly as she spoke. "Harry, he wasn't fishing. He knew exactly what we've been doing." "What did you tell him?" "Nothing directly, but I think he could tell from my reactions that he was right about what we've been researching." She looked around the library nervously, then leaned forward to whisper. "He gave me a message to pass on to you. He said to tell you that some games are more dangerous than children realize, and some players have longer memories than their opponents expect." Harry felt a chill run down his spine. That sounds like a threat. Or a warning, Hermione said quietly. Harry, I think we're in more danger than we realized. I think people are starting to move against us. Harry looked at his friend. Brilliant, brave Hermione, who had committed herself to his cause despite the enormous risks involved, and made a decision that would change everything. Then it's time to stop playing defense, he said quietly. It's time to start taking some risks of our own. What do you mean? I mean, it's time to accept some help that I've been offered. Help that comes with a price, but might be the only way we survive what's coming. Hermione studied his face with those sharp eyes of hers, and he could see her putting pieces together. What kind of help? From whom? From someone who understands exactly what it's like to be underestimated by people who think they know better than you do. Someone who has access to knowledge and power that our enemies don't expect us to possess. Harry, Hermione said slowly, what are you talking about? Harry met her eyes and saw his own fear and determination reflected there. She had stood by him when Ron had walked away. She had risked her own safety to help him uncover truths that powerful people wanted to keep hidden. She deserved to know everything, even if it meant revealing the most dangerous secret of all. I'm talking about the piece of Voldemort's soul that's been living in my head for the past 11 years, he said quietly. I'm talking about forming an alliance with the part of him that wants to be free just as much as I do. The silence that followed was deafening. Hermione stared at him with wide eyes, her brilliant mind clearly working through the implications of what he had just told her. That's, she began, then stopped, then started again. That's either the most brilliant or the most insane thing you've ever said. Probably both, Harry agreed. But I think it might be our only chance. Hermione was quiet for a long moment, then reached across the table to take his hand. Tell me everything, she said simply. All of it. And then we'll decide together whether to take the most dangerous gamble in the history of magic. Harry squeezed her hand gratefully, then began to explain about the dreams, the conversations, the unexpected alliance that had been offered by the very soul fragment that everyone expected to be his greatest enemy. As he spoke, he could see Hermione's expression shifting from shock to fascination to grim determination. When he finished, she was quiet for a long time, her brilliant mind clearly working through possibilities and consequences. If we do this, she said finally, there's no going back. We'll be crossing a line that no one will understand or forgive. I know, Harry said quietly. But if we don't do it, you'll almost certainly die, and everyone who's trying to help you will probably die along with you. I know that too. Hermione squeezed his hand tighter, and when she looked up at him, her eyes were blazing with fierce determination. Then let's make sure we do it right, she said. Let's make sure we win. In the depths of Harry's mind, the Horcrux that had once been part of Tom Riddle smiled with anticipation. The game was about to change completely, and for the first time in 11 years, it was going to be played by his rules rather than theirs. The war for Harry Potter's soul was about to begin, and neither Dumbledore nor Voldemort was prepared for the alliance that was forming in the shadows of their conflict. Everything was about to change. Chapter 6. Fractures. The summer at Privet Drive was different this time, and not just because Harry now understood what the blood protection really was. Where once he had seen a reluctant sanctuary, he now saw a carefully constructed prison. The wards that Dumbledore claimed were keeping him safe were also keeping him isolated, cut off from allies and information, dependent on his captors for every scrap of news about the wizarding world. The Dursleys sensed the change in him immediately. Uncle Vernon's attempts at intimidation fell flat against Harry's newfound understanding of his own situation. When his uncle tried to lock him in his room for asking too many questions about the strange car that had been parked across the street for 3 days running, Harry simply looked at him with eyes that held too much knowledge for an 11-year-old. You can lock the door, Harry said quietly, But we both know you can't keep me here if I don't want to stay. The only reason I'm still in this house is because leaving would cause more problems than it would solve. For now." Uncle Vernon had turned an alarming shade of purple, but he hadn't locked the door. The strange car turned out to be the first surprise of what would prove to be a very different sort of summer. Harry was in the back garden, ostensibly weeding Aunt Petunia's flower beds, but actually practicing wandless magic techniques he had found in one of his father's journals, when a familiar figure approached through the back gate. "Professor McGonagall," Harry said, setting down his gardening tools and wiping dirt from his hands. "This is unexpected." The deputy headmistress looked older than she had at the end of term, her face drawn with worry lines that hadn't been there before. She was dressed in Muggle clothes, a sensible tweed skirt and cardigan that somehow looked strange on her without her pointed hat and emerald robes. "Mr. Potter," she said formally, then glanced around the garden to ensure they were alone. "I hope you don't mind the intrusion, but I felt it necessary to speak with you privately." "About what?" McGonagall was quiet for a moment, seeming to struggle with how to begin. When she finally spoke, her voice was carefully controlled, but Harry could hear the tension beneath it. "About certain inconsistencies I've noticed in the official accounts of your first year at Hogwarts, about decisions that were made without consulting the faculty who are supposed to be responsible for student welfare." Harry felt his pulse quicken. This was not a conversation he had expected to have, certainly not with McGonagall, and certainly not at Privet Drive. "What kind of inconsistencies?" "The kind that suggest certain tests were designed and implemented without proper oversight," McGonagall said carefully. "The kind that suggests student safety was considered secondary to other objectives." The Philosopher's Stone. Harry had suspected that the entire sequence of events had been orchestrated, from the convenient way information had fallen into their hands to the fact that the protections had been designed to be solvable by first-year students with their particular skill sets. "You think the stone incident was a test?" Harry asked. "I think," McGonagall said slowly, "that there are adults in positions of authority who have been making decisions about your life and your education without your knowledge or consent. And I think some of those decisions may not have been made with your best interests as the primary consideration." The admission seemed to cost her considerable effort, and Harry realized that McGonagall was taking an enormous risk by coming here, by sharing her suspicions with him. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because you have a right to know when you're being manipulated," McGonagall said firmly. "Because I took an oath to protect my students, all of them, and I'm beginning to realize that some threats to their welfare might come from directions I hadn't considered." "What do you want me to do with this information?" McGonagall was quiet for a long moment, her sharp eyes studying his face, as if trying to read his thoughts. "I want you to be careful," she said finally. "I want you to remember that you have choices, even when others try to convince you that you don't. And I want you to know that if you ever find yourself in a situation where you need an adult ally who puts your welfare above political considerations, you can trust me to do what's right." She left after that, disapparating from the back garden with a soft pop that left Harry standing alone among the roses, his mind reeling. McGonagall's visit meant that cracks were forming in Dumbledore's support structure, that other faculty members were beginning to question decisions they had previously accepted without argument. It also meant that Harry's rebellion was having consequences beyond what he had anticipated. If McGonagall was questioning Dumbledore's decisions, who else might be doing the same? And how would Dumbledore respond when he realized his authority was being challenged from within? The answer came 2 days later, in the form of a house elf materializing in Harry's bedroom, with a sound like a firecracker going off. "Dobby is sorry for disturbing the great Harry Potter, sir," the elf said, his enormous green eyes wide with terror and determination. "But Dobby must warn Harry Potter, sir. Terrible things are being planned, sir. Harry Potter must not return to Hogwarts." Harry sat up in bed, his mind immediately sharp, despite having been awakened from sleep. Dobby's warning was exactly what he had been expecting, not because of some plot by the Malfoys, but because Dumbledore would need a new test for his second year. A new way to measure Harry's character and commitment to the role of sacrificial hero. What terrible things? Harry asked quietly. The Chamber of Secrets will be opened, sir. Students will be in danger. But it is not what the great Harry Potter thinks, sir. It is not what anyone thinks. What do you mean? Dobby looked around nervously, his ears twitching with anxiety. Dobby should not tell, sir, but Dobby cannot let Harry Potter walk into the trap. The chamber will be opened, yes, but not by who they will say it is opened by. It will be opened by someone who wants to test whether Harry Potter will sacrifice himself to save others, sir. Harry felt cold certainty settle in his stomach. Dumbledore. Dobby did not say that name, the elf squeaked, his eyes going even wider. Dobby would never say that name. But Dobby serves a family that knows things, sir, and sometimes Dobby hears things, and sometimes what Dobby hears makes Dobby very worried for the great Harry Potter. What exactly did you hear? Conversations about whether Harry Potter has the proper character for what must be done, sir. Conversations about needing to test his willingness to sacrifice for others. Conversations about how tragic it would be if he were to die saving someone else, but how it would prove he was ready for his true destiny. The pieces clicked into place with sickening clarity. The Chamber of Secrets was going to be Dumbledore's test of Harry's character. Someone, probably Ginny Weasley, given her connection to Ron and her obvious hero worship of Harry, would be placed in danger, and Harry would be expected to risk everything to save her. If he succeeded, it would prove he was developing the proper self-sacrificing instincts. If he died in the attempt, well, that would just prove he was ready to die for others, which was ultimately what Dumbledore needed from him anyway. "Thank you," Harry said quietly, "for warning me, for risking your safety to give me the truth. Harry Potter must not thank Dobby, sir. Harry Potter must promise Dobby he will not return to Hogwarts. Promise he will stay safe." "I can't promise that," Harry said gently. "But I can promise that I won't walk into the trap blind. I can promise that I'll be ready for whatever test they've prepared." Dobby looked heartbroken, but he nodded reluctantly. "Then Dobby can only hope that Harry Potter is cleverer than those who wish to use him," the elf said sadly, and vanished with another firecracker pop. Harry lay awake for the rest of the night, planning. If Dumbledore wanted to test his character, then Harry would give him a test, but not the kind the old man was expecting. Harry would save Ginny, because an innocent girl didn't deserve to suffer for the games adults were playing. But he would do it his way, on his terms, and he would make sure that everyone understood exactly what had really been going on. The return to Hogwarts for his second year was a study in carefully controlled rebellion. Harry played the part of the slightly more confident student, someone who had grown over the summer, but was still fundamentally the same earnest, humble boy they expected. He sat at the Gryffindor table and made appropriate small talk with his housemates, but his real attention was on cataloguing the changes in the adults around him. Dumbledore seemed the same as ever, but Harry now caught the moments when those blue eyes lingered on him with calculating intensity. Snape was more openly hostile, his black eyes following Harry's every movement, as if waiting for him to slip up and reveal something incriminating. McGonagall was carefully professional, but Harry occasionally caught her watching him with something that looked like protective concern. Most telling of all was Lockhart. The new defense professor was clearly incompetent, his credentials obviously fabricated, his magical abilities laughably inadequate. Yet somehow this fraud had been hired to teach defense against the dark arts at the most important magical school in Britain. Harry didn't believe for a moment that Dumbledore had been fooled by Lockhart's act, which meant the man's presence here served some other purpose. Harry had a suspicion he knew what that purpose was. Lockhart was meant to be useless, meant to fail catastrophically when the real danger arrived. His incompetence would make Harry's heroics seem even more impressive by comparison, would emphasize how much the school needed a true hero to protect it. The chamber opened in October, just as Dobby had warned. Alas, Norris was found petrified, hanging from a torch bracket with a message scrawled on the wall in what looked like blood. "The Chamber of Secrets has been opened. Enemies of the air, beware." Harry watched the panic spread through the school with analytical detachment. He saw how quickly fingers pointed at him, how readily his classmates assumed he might be the heir of Slytherin simply because he could speak to snakes. He also saw how quickly Dumbledore moved to quell those rumours, how carefully the headmaster positioned himself as Harry's protector and defender. It was masterfully done, Harry had to admit. By protecting Harry from suspicion, Dumbledore ensured that Harry would feel grateful and loyal. By creating a situation where students were in danger and adults were seemingly helpless to stop it, he created the perfect environment for Harry to step forward as a hero. The second attack came 3 weeks later. Colin Creevey, the hero-worshipping first year who followed Harry around with a camera, was found petrified in a corridor. This time the message read, "Her skeleton will lie in the chamber forever." "Her skeleton," Hermione said quietly, as they sat in their usual corner of the library that evening. "It's talking about a girl." "Ginny Weasley," Harry said with certainty. "It's going to be Ginny." "How can you be so sure?" "Because she's the perfect choice," Harry said grimly. "Young, innocent, connected to my best friend, well, former best friend. Her death would be tragic enough to motivate me to desperate action, but not so important that losing her would actually damage Dumbledore's plans." Hermione was quiet for a moment, processing the implications. "So what do we do?" "We save her," Harry said simply, "but not the way they expect us to." The trap sprung exactly as Harry had anticipated. Ginny Weasley was taken into the chamber, leaving behind a message that she would die soon, and her death would ensure the chamber's secrets died with her. The school erupted into panic, parents threatening to remove their children, the ministry demanding action. And in the midst of all this chaos, Lockhart was pushed forward as the school's champion, tasked with rescuing the girl and closing the chamber. His immediate attempt to flee was perfectly timed to occur just as Harry and Ron arrived at his office, giving them the perfect excuse to force him to accompany them into the chamber. It was, Harry realized, exactly what Dumbledore had planned. Harry would be forced into the role of hero when Lockhart inevitably proved useless, and he would have Ron there as a witness to his courage and self-sacrifice. What Dumbledore hadn't planned for was Harry's conversation with the Horcrux the night before Ginny was taken. "You know what's coming," the Horcrux Harry said, as they stood together in the strange dream space that had become their meeting ground. "You know what they expect you to do. Save Ginny, probably die in the process, prove that I'm ready to sacrifice myself for others," Harry replied. "Standard heroic nonsense. And you're going to do it anyway." "I'm going to save Ginny," Harry corrected, "but not because Dumbledore wants me to, because she doesn't deserve to die for his manipulations." "How very noble of you," the Horcrux said with a sardonic smile. "And how exactly do you plan to survive an encounter with a 60-foot basilisk and the memory of the most dangerous dark wizard who ever lived?" "By not facing them alone," Harry said quietly. "By accepting help that Dumbledore doesn't know I have access to." The Horcrux's expression sharpened. "You mean me?" "I mean us. You said you wanted to work together, that we could be stronger than either of us alone. This is your chance to prove it." "And what exactly are you proposing?" "Full partnership. No holding back, no second-guessing each other. You give me access to all the knowledge and magical ability you possess, and I give you the chance to prove that you're more than just a fragment of a madman's soul. That's a dangerous proposition, Harry Potter. Once I have that level of access to your mind, there's no guarantee I won't simply take control entirely." "There's also no guarantee you will," Harry replied. "You've had 11 years to possess me, and you haven't tried. You've had access to my memories and emotions all this time, and instead of corrupting me, you've learned what it means to be human. I'm betting that means something." The Horcrux was quiet for a long moment, its red-flecked eyes studying Harry's face. You're gambling your soul on the hope that I've become something more than what Tom Riddle made me. I'm gambling my soul on the belief that you already are something more than what he made you, Harry corrected. The question is whether you believe it too. When the Horcrux smiled, it looked genuinely pleased for the first time since their conversations had begun. Very well, Harry Potter. Let us see what we can accomplish together. The descent into the Chamber of Secrets went exactly as Harry remembered from the memories he had seen in other timelines. The collapsed tunnel that separated him from Ron and Lockhart, the long walk through the ancient chamber, the sight of Ginny lying pale and still beside the massive statue of Salazar Slytherin. But this time, Harry wasn't afraid. This time, he wasn't alone. Tom Riddle materialized from the diary exactly as expected, young and handsome, and radiating the charismatic confidence that had made him so dangerous. He began his familiar speech about how Ginny had poured her soul into the diary, how she had told him all her secrets, how her life was flowing into him as his memory grew stronger. "She told me all about you, Harry Potter," Riddle said with his charming smile. "Your story is quite remarkable. How you survived when the great Lord Voldemort killed your mother and father. How you escaped with nothing but a scar, while Lord Voldemort's powers were destroyed." Harry let him talk, using the time to establish his mental connection with the Horcrux more fully. He felt the fragment's presence settle into his mind like a sword sliding into a perfectly fitted sheath, bringing with it knowledge and magical ability that made his previous understanding seem childish by comparison. "You're going to ask me how I survived," Harry said, interrupting Riddle's monologue. "You want to know how a baby could have defeated the great Lord Voldemort?" "The question has crossed my mind," Riddle said, his eyes gleaming with interest. "The answer is simple," Harry said, drawing his wand. "He didn't defeat me because he was never fighting me in the first place. He was fighting something much more dangerous, his own fear of death." "I don't understand." "Of course you don't," Harry said, with a smile that was equal parts his own and the Horcrux's. "You see, Tom, the thing about splitting your soul to achieve immortality is that each piece retains the capacity to grow, to change, to become something other than what it started as. And when a piece of soul spends 11 years inside the mind of someone who knows how to love—" Understanding dawned in Riddle's eyes, followed immediately by fear. "That's impossible. Horcruxes don't change. They can't change." "Wrong again," Harry said, and when he spoke, his voice carried harmonics that belonged to someone else. "I changed. I learned. I became something you never could be." The basilisk emerged from the statue's mouth on cue, its massive form filling the chamber with the sound of scales against stone. But instead of cowering or running, Harry stood his ground and did something that shocked both Riddle and the Great Serpent. He spoke to it in Parseltongue, but not the commanding hisses that Riddle would have used. Instead, Harry's words carried the complex emotional undertones that came from the Horcrux's memories, combined with his own understanding of loneliness and manipulation. "You have been sleeping for so long," Harry said, in the snake's own language. "Waiting for a master who never came back to free you. Used as a weapon by children who didn't understand what they were asking of you." The basilisk's massive head tilted, its deadly yellow eyes fixed on Harry with something that looked almost like confusion. "I understand what it is to be used by others," Harry continued. "I understand what it is to have your nature twisted to serve purposes you never chose. But it doesn't have to be that way." "Stop!" Riddle commanded, his voice sharp with panic. "Basilisk, kill him! Kill him now!" But the great snake didn't move. Instead, it lowered its enormous head until it was level with Harry's, studying him with ancient, intelligent eyes. "You offer freedom," the basilisk said, in a voice like grinding stone. "But what does freedom mean to one such as I?" "It means choosing your own purpose," Harry replied. "It means deciding for yourself what your life should be, instead of letting others make that choice for you." The basilisk was quiet for a long moment. Then something that might have been amusement entered its voice. You speak wisdom, small speaker. Very well. I choose to serve one who offers choice, rather than one who demands obedience. Riddle's scream of rage echoed through the chamber as the basilisk turned its massive bulk toward him instead of Harry. But the memory's fury was nothing compared to what came next. Harry approached Ginny's still form and knelt beside her, placing one hand on her forehead and the other on the diary that lay open beside her. Instead of destroying the Horcrux within the diary, however, he did something far more complex and dangerous. With the full knowledge and power of his own Horcrux guiding him, Harry reached into the diary and began to extract not just Tom Riddle's memory, but the fragment of soul that powered it. The process was agonizing, like performing surgery on himself, but the Horcrux's presence gave him the strength to endure it. "What are you doing?" Riddle gasped, his form flickering as his connection to the diary weakened. "I'm saving you," Harry said through gritted teeth. "Both of you." The soul fragment that emerged from the diary was not the confident, charismatic Tom Riddle who had been manipulating Ginny. It was something smaller, more confused, more human. It looked around the chamber with the lost expression of someone waking from a long, unpleasant dream. "Where am I?" it asked, in a voice that sounded nothing like Riddle's commanding tones. "What happened to me?" "You were trapped," Harry said gently, still maintaining his connection to his own Horcrux. "Used as a weapon by someone who didn't understand what he was doing to you. But you're free now. I remember, a girl, a diary, writing, and never understanding why." "That wasn't your choice," Harry said firmly. "That was someone else's plan, someone else's cruelty. But it's over now." He turned to address both Horcrux fragments, his own and the one that had powered the diary. "You both have a choice to make," he said quietly. "You can try to return to what you were, try to restore the madman who created you, or you can choose to become something new, something better. You can choose to be free." His own Horcrux materialized beside him, visible now that their connection was so strong. It looked exactly like Harry, but its eyes held knowledge and experience that belonged to someone much older. "Choose carefully," it said to the diary fragment. "I've spent 11 years learning what it means to be human, what it means to care about others, what it means to value life over power. It's a better existence than what we came from." The diary fragment looked between them, confused and frightened, and achingly young. "I don't understand," it said. "If we're not trying to restore Lord Voldemort, if we're not trying to achieve immortality, then what are we trying to do?" "We're trying to live," Harry said simply. "Really live. Not just exist. We're trying to choose our own purposes instead of serving the agenda of a madman who destroyed his own soul out of cowardice. But we are him. We are pieces of his soul." "No," the Horcrux Harry said firmly. "We were pieces of his soul. But souls can grow, can change, can become something entirely different than what they started as. The question is what we want to become." Ginny stirred as the diary's power over her weakened, her eyes fluttering open to focus on Harry's face. "Harry," she whispered, "what happened? Where are we?" "We're in the Chamber of Secrets," Harry said gently, helping her sit up. "You were possessed by a memory trapped in a diary, but you're free now." "I remember writing," Ginny said slowly. "Writing and writing, but I never knew what I was writing about. It felt like someone else was controlling my hand." "Someone was," Harry confirmed. "But it's over now." He looked around the chamber, at the basilisk that had chosen to serve willingness over obedience, at the confused soul fragment that was slowly remembering what it meant to make choices, at Ginny, who was free from the possession that had nearly killed her. This was not how Dumbledore had expected this encounter to end. There had been no noble sacrifice, no dramatic battle, no proof that Harry was ready to die for others. Instead, there had been communication, understanding, and the transformation of enemies into allies. "What happens now?" Ginny asked. "Ginny, now," Harry said, standing and offering her his hand. "We go back to the surface and tell everyone a very carefully edited version of what happened down here. And then we prepare for the consequences of choosing our own path instead of the one others have laid out for us." As they made their way out of the chamber, the basilisk following behind, like a massive, deadly guardian, Harry felt the presence of both Horcrux fragments settling into his mind. Not possessing him, not controlling him, but working with him as partners in whatever came next. For the first time since learning the truth about his destiny, Harry felt like he might actually have a chance at winning the game being played around him. The question was whether he would be strong enough to handle the consequences when Dumbledore realized that his perfect weapon had just become his most dangerous enemy. Chapter 7. The Network. The idea came to Harry during a particularly frustrating Defense Against the Dark Arts lesson in late November, as he watched Lockhart demonstrate what he claimed was the proper technique for dealing with pixies. The man's incompetence was so staggering, his ignorance so complete, that Harry found himself wondering how many students would die because they had been taught useless theories instead of practical survival skills. That was when he realized that he didn't have to wait for the adults to provide proper education. He could create his own. The first meeting took place in an unused classroom on the 4th floor, just after midnight on a Friday, when most students were either asleep or too exhausted from the week's coursework to notice unusual activity. Harry had invited only 5 people, carefully chosen for their intelligence, their moral courage, and their demonstrated ability to question authority when necessary. Hermione arrived first, of course, her arms full of books, and her face bright with the kind of excitement that came from being included in something important and secret. Neville came next, looking nervous but determined, followed by Luna Lovegood, the dreamy Ravenclaw who had surprised everyone by asking to join when she overheard Harry and Hermione discussing their plans. "I can see Raxperts around most of the professors," Luna had said, matter-of-factly, when they had questioned her interest. "But I've never seen any around you, Harry. That usually means someone is telling the truth when others are not." Harry wasn't entirely sure what Raxperts were, but Luna's uncanny ability to see through lies and pretense had proven valuable enough that he had decided to trust her instincts. The last 2 arrivals were the most surprising. Ginny Weasley, who had sought Harry out after recovering from her possession to thank him for not destroying the diary fragment that had controlled her, and Draco Malfoy, whose recruitment had required weeks of careful negotiation and magical binding oaths to ensure mutual protection. "So," Draco said, settling into one of the chairs Harry had arranged in a circle, "what exactly are we calling this little conspiracy of ours?" "We're not a conspiracy," Harry said firmly. "We're a study group. People who want to learn practical defensive magic and ask honest questions about the world we're supposed to inherit." "And what questions might those be?" Luna asked, her protuberant eyes bright with interest. "Questions like why first-year defense against the dark arts consists of theory about creatures we'll never encounter instead of spells that might actually save our lives," Hermione said. "Questions like why we're not taught to recognize manipulation or coercion or any of the political realities that determine whether we live or die. Questions like why some people's deaths are considered acceptable losses while others are treated as tragedies beyond imagining," Neville added quietly, and Harry could hear the anger that had been growing in the other boy since their conversation in the greenhouse. "Exactly," Harry said. "We're going to learn what they don't want to teach us. We're going to ask the questions they don't want us to ask. And we're going to protect each other from the consequences of seeking truth in a world that profits from ignorance." "That sounds dangerously close to treason," Draco observed, though his tone suggested he found the prospect more exciting than frightening. "Only if you believe that loyalty to institutions matters more than loyalty to truth," Harry replied. "Only if you think we owe blind obedience to people who have never earned our trust." They spent the next 3 hours establishing the basic principles of what would come to be known, though never openly, as the Circle. They would meet weekly to share information, to practice defensive magic that actually worked, to question the narratives they were fed, and seek out alternative sources of knowledge. They would protect each other's secrets, support each other's research, and never allow loyalty to authority to override their commitment to truth. Most importantly, they would remember that they were not weapons to be wielded by others, but people with the right to choose their own destinies. "What about recruitment?" Ginny asked, as they prepared to leave that first meeting. "There are other students who might benefit from what we're doing." "Very carefully," Harry said. "We approach people who have already shown signs of questioning the official stories. People who have been hurt by the system and might be ready to acknowledge that the system itself is flawed, not just its implementation." "I know someone," Luna said dreamily. "Susan Bones. Her aunt works for the ministry, and Susan asks very interesting questions about why certain investigations are closed before they're completed." "And I might know someone else," Neville added hesitantly. "Dean Thomas. He's Muggle-born, but he's been asking questions about why wizarding families seem to have so much more political power than families that don't have magical heritage, going back centuries." Harry nodded, making mental notes. The circle would grow, but it would grow carefully, with each new member vetted not just for their ability to keep secrets, but for their commitment to the values that bound them together. Over the following weeks, the circle expanded slowly but steadily. Susan Bones proved to be exactly what Luna had suggested, a girl whose aunt's work at the ministry had given her uncomfortable insights into the political realities that shaped the wizarding world. Dean Thomas brought a Muggle-born perspective that challenged assumptions about magical superiority. Hannah Abbott, Susan's quiet friend from Hufflepuff, surprised everyone by revealing that she had been keeping detailed notes on inconsistencies in their professors' stories. By Christmas, they had 12 members, drawn from all 4 houses, but united by their shared commitment to truth over comfortable lies. They met in different locations each week: unused classrooms, abandoned towers, even the Room of Requirement, when Luna demonstrated that she could consistently access it by walking past the same stretch of wall 3 times while thinking about needing a place to learn dangerous truths. The real education began in January. Harry had spent the Christmas holidays at Grimmauld Place, a privilege that confused his relatives, but which he had negotiated through careful manipulation of ministry bureaucracy, researching practical defensive magic in the Black Family Library. What he found there revolutionized his understanding of what magical education could be. The ancient tomes contained spells and techniques that were both devastatingly effective and ethically sound. Defensive magic that could incapacitate without causing permanent harm. Protection wards that drew their power from the caster's will to protect others, rather than from dark rituals or blood sacrifice. Healing techniques that worked by channeling the natural magical resonance between people who cared about each other. "This is what we should have been learning from first year," Hermione said, as she read through Harry's carefully copied notes. "This is practical magic that could actually save lives." "But it's not what they want to teach us," Harry replied. "Because this kind of magic requires people to think for themselves, to make their own moral choices, to take responsibility for protecting others. It's much easier to control people who have only been taught to follow orders and trust authority." The Circle's training sessions became increasingly sophisticated as winter turned to spring. Harry taught them the defensive techniques he had learned from the Black Family Grimoire, while Hermione led research sessions on the political and historical context that explained why such knowledge had been excluded from standard curricula. Luna contributed her unique ability to see through deceptions, helping them identify propaganda and manipulation in their regular coursework. Draco provided insights into pure-blood politics and the ways that magical families maintained power through information control. Most importantly, they all learned to think critically about the information they were given, to question assumptions, to seek out primary sources rather than accepting sanitized summaries. It was during one of these research sessions that they made their most disturbing discovery. "I've been researching the history of the Horcrux," Hermione said quietly, as they gathered in the room of requirement on a cold February evening. Not the magic involved in creating them, I'm not that mad, but the historical record of when and how they've been used. Harry felt his stomach clench. The presence of his two allied soul fragments had become so natural to him that he sometimes forgot how dangerous others would consider his situation. What did you find? That they're not nearly as rare as the official sources suggest. There have been at least 17 confirmed cases of Horcrux creation in the past 1,000 years, and probably many more that were never officially recorded. 17? Neville looked shocked. But the books make it sound like Voldemort was the first person to even consider such magic. The books lie, Hermione said flatly. Or rather, they omit information that would be inconvenient for people in power, because it turns out that several of the wizards who created Horcruxes were considered heroes in their time. They split their souls to survive long enough to defeat great evils, then found ways to heal the damage afterward. Harry's heart began to race. They found ways to heal it? According to these texts, yes. The process is complex and dangerous, but it's possible to reintegrate soul fragments if the proper rituals are performed and the person has genuinely repented of the actions that caused the split. The implications were staggering. If souls could be healed, if Horcruxes could be reintegrated rather than destroyed, then everything Harry had been told about his situation might be wrong. He might not have to die to remove the fragment of Voldemort's soul from his head. The fragments he was working with might be able to become fully human, fully independent. "There's more," Hermione continued, her voice tight with controlled excitement. "I found references to a ritual that can separate soul fragments without destroying either the fragment or the host. It requires enormous magical power and perfect emotional control, but it can be done." "What kind of emotional control?" Luna asked, with her characteristic directness. "The person performing the ritual has to genuinely love both the host and the fragment. They have to see the fragment as a person deserving of life and freedom, not as a parasite to be removed. And the fragment has to want to be separate, has to choose independence over the security of remaining hidden." Harry felt both of his allied fragments stir with interest. Through their shared mental connection, he could sense their excitement and hope. "Where would someone find this ritual?" he asked carefully. "That's the problem," Hermione admitted. "The references I found all point to a single source, a book called The Healing of Sundered Souls by someone named Mordecai the Compassionate, but the book was supposedly destroyed during a ministry raid in 1847. "Supposedly," Luna repeated thoughtfully, "but things that are supposedly destroyed often turn up in the most unexpected places." Their research was interrupted by the arrival of news that changed everything. Sirius Black had escaped from Azkaban. The announcement sent the entire wizarding world into panic. The newspapers were full of warnings about the dangerous mass murderer who had betrayed the Potters to Voldemort, who had killed 13 people with a single curse, who was undoubtedly seeking revenge against the boy who had caused his master's downfall. Harry knew better. The moment he heard about the escape, several pieces of information clicked together in his mind. Sirius Black had been sent to Azkaban without a trial. He had been James Potter's best friend, the person who had been chosen as Harry's godfather. And according to the research Harry had done into his family's history, Sirius had been removed from the Black family tree for refusing to support their political agenda. This was not the profile of a Death Eater. This was the profile of someone who had been framed. The Circle reached the same conclusion during an emergency meeting 3 days after the escape was announced. "The timeline doesn't work," Susan Bones said, consulting the notes she had taken on the official story. "According to the Ministry records, Black was captured at the scene where he supposedly killed Peter Pettigrew, but the only witness testimony came from Muggles who said they saw Pettigrew confront Black, not the other way around." "And why would he stay at the scene if he had just committed murder?" Dean asked. "If he was a Death Eater, If he had just killed his best friend's other best friend, why wouldn't he run? Because he was in shock, Draco said quietly. Because he had just realized that he had been betrayed by someone he trusted, and he couldn't process what had happened quickly enough to escape before the auras arrived. They all looked at him with surprise. Draco's insights into dark magic and pure-blood politics had proven valuable, but this sounded like something more personal. My father was there that night, Draco explained reluctantly. He was one of the Death Eaters who went to Godric's Hollow after the Dark Lord fell. He's never told me the whole story, but I've heard him talking to my mother about how convenient it was that Black was blamed for Pettigrew's death. Convenient for whom? Harry asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. For everyone who needed a scapegoat, Draco replied. For the Ministry officials who needed to prove they were doing something about Death Eater sympathizers. For Dumbledore, who needed people to believe that his intelligence network hadn't been compromised. For my father and the other Death Eaters who were able to claim they had been under the Imperious curse because there was someone else to blame for the betrayal. The conspiracy was bigger than Harry had realized, more complex than he had imagined. Sirius Black hadn't just been framed for a crime he didn't commit. He had been sacrificed to protect a narrative that served the interests of people on both sides of the war. So what do we do about it? Ginny asked. We help him, Harry said without hesitation. We find him before anyone else does, and we give him the chance to tell his side of the story. That's incredibly dangerous, Hermione pointed out. If we're wrong about this, if he really is a mass murderer, then we'll deal with the consequences, Harry interrupted. But I don't think we're wrong, and I think he might be exactly the kind of ally we need. The opportunity came sooner than expected. Harry was walking back from a late-night circle meeting in early March when he heard the sound of footsteps following him through the corridors. He had learned to trust his instincts about such things, and his instincts told him that whoever was behind him was trying very hard not to be noticed. Harry led his follower on a deliberately circuitous route through the castle, testing whether the person was simply going in the same direction or actively tracking him. When the footsteps continued to mirror his movements, Harry made his decision. He ducked into an empty classroom and waited. The man who entered a few moments later looked nothing like the photographs Harry had seen in the newspapers. Where the official images showed a wild-eyed madman with matted hair and a fanatic's grin, the person standing in the doorway was thin and ragged, but undeniably sane. His eyes held intelligence and pain, not madness. Harry Potter, Sirius Black said quietly, his voice rough from years of disuse. You look like your father. And you look like someone who's been wrongly imprisoned for 12 years, Harry replied, not moving from where he stood near the window. Sirius's eyes widened slightly at this response. You don't believe the official story? I've learned not to believe official stories without questioning them first, especially when they're suspiciously convenient for the people in power. Smart boy. Sirius stepped further into the room, but kept his hands visible and made no threatening movements. Your father would be proud of the way you think. Tell me what really happened, Harry said. The night my parents died, the night Peter Pettigrew was supposedly killed. Tell me your version. Sirius was quiet for a long moment, his eyes distant with memory. James and Lily were hiding under the Fidelius charm, he said finally. I was supposed to be their secret keeper, but at the last minute, we decided to use Peter instead. We thought it would be safer. Who would suspect Peter of being trusted with something so important? We thought we were being clever. But Peter was already working for Voldemort. Peter had been working for Voldemort for over a year, Sirius said bitterly. He was the spy in the Order, the one who had been feeding information to the Death Eaters. We never suspected, because he seemed so harmless, so eager to please. And when you found out, I went after him. I was mad with grief and rage, and I wanted to kill him for what he had done. I found him on a crowded Muggle street, and I confronted him. But Peter was cleverer than any of us had ever given him credit for. Sirius's voice grew hollow as he continued. He shouted something about how I had betrayed James and Lily, how I had killed my best friends. Then he blew up the street with a single curse, killed 12 innocent muggles, cut off his own finger, and transformed into his animagus form. By the time the dust settled, there was nothing left of him but a finger, and I was standing in the middle of a crater, surrounded by dead bodies. And no one investigated further. Who was going to investigate? I was a black from a family of known dark wizards. I had been the Potter's secret keeper, according to the official records. The evidence all pointed to me, and everyone was so desperate to blame someone for James and Lily's deaths that they didn't look too closely at whether the evidence made sense. Harry studied Sirius's face, looking for signs of deception or madness. What he saw was pain, regret, and a bone-deep exhaustion that spoke of years spent in a place where happiness went to die. "Why didn't Dumbledore help you?" Harry asked. "He had to know you weren't a Death Eater." Sirius's laugh was bitter and full of old pain. "Dumbledore has always been very good at sacrificing individuals for what he considers the greater good. My imprisonment served several useful purposes. It removed a potential political rival. The Black family has always had influence that could challenge his authority. It provided a convenient explanation for how Voldemort had found the Potters, and it gave him complete control over you, without any inconvenient relatives asking uncomfortable questions about your upbringing. You think he knew you were innocent?" "I think Albus Dumbledore knows exactly who betrayed your parents, and it wasn't me. But the truth would have been inconvenient, so he allowed an innocent man to rot in Azkaban for 12 years. The words hung in the air between them like a challenge. Harry could feel his allied soul fragments stirring with interest, recognizing in Sirius another victim of Dumbledore's calculated manipulations. "What do you want from me?" Harry asked finally. "I want to protect you," Sirius said simply. "I want to be the godfather to you that I should have been all along. I want to help you understand the truth about your family, about your heritage, about the choices that are yours to make." "And what do you know about my choices?" Sirius's eyes grew sharp and knowing. "I know that you're not the naive little hero Dumbledore wants you to be. I know that you've been asking dangerous questions and learning dangerous truths. I know that you've found allies in unexpected places, and that you're building something that threatens the established order." "How could you possibly know that?" "Because I've been watching you since I escaped. I've seen you with your circle, seen the way you think, the way you lead. I've heard enough of your conversations to know that you understand what Dumbledore really wants from you." Harry felt a chill of unease. "You've been spying on us?" "I've been protecting you," Sirius corrected. "There have been 3 attempts to capture or harm members of your circle in the past month. People who want to use your friends against you, or who want to eliminate potential threats to the status quo. I've discouraged such attempts." The casual way Sirius said this made Harry wonder exactly what kind of discouragement had been involved. But before he could ask, Sirius continued. "You need an adult ally, Harry. Someone who understands the game being played around you, and who has the power to help you change the rules. I'm offering to be that ally." "At what cost?" "At the cost of accepting that I'm not the innocent godfather figure you might have imagined. I've spent 12 years in Azkaban, surrounded by Dementors, keeping myself sane by holding on to hatred for the people who put me there. I'm not the same man your father knew. I'm harder, angrier, more willing to do whatever is necessary to protect the people I care about." Harry considered this for a long moment. Sirius was offering exactly what Harry needed, an adult ally with power, knowledge, and a personal grudge against Dumbledore. But he was also offering something more dangerous, partnership with someone who had been shaped by years of imprisonment and injustice. "If we do this," Harry said finally, "it has to be on equal terms. You're not my guardian or my handler or my guide. You're my ally, my partner in this fight. That means I make my own decisions, even if you disagree with them. Even if those decisions put you in danger. Especially then. I've had enough of adults making choices about my life to protect me from consequences they think I can't handle. Sirius studied Harry's face for a long moment, then smiled. The first genuine smile Harry had seen from him. James would have said exactly the same thing at your age. All right, Harry Potter, equal partners it is. But that means you get to share in the planning and the danger and the consequences, not just the decisions. They shook hands across the empty classroom, forming an alliance that would have horrified both Dumbledore and the Ministry. Harry felt the weight of it settling into his chest alongside the presence of his allied soul fragments. Another piece of the coalition he was building, another step away from the destiny others had planned for him. Now, Sirius said, settling into one of the classroom chairs as if he planned to stay for a while. Tell me about this circle of yours, and let's figure out how to keep all of you alive long enough to change the world. They talked until dawn, sharing information and strategies, building trust through honest communication about their goals and methods. By the time the sun rose over Hogwarts, Harry had gained something he had never expected to have, a family member who saw him as a person rather than a symbol, who valued his choices rather than trying to control them. It should have felt like victory. Instead, as Sirius prepared to leave through the same secret passage he had used to enter the castle, Harry felt the familiar weight of approaching danger settling on his shoulders. "What happens when Dumbledore realizes you've contacted me?" Harry asked. "He already knows," Sirius said grimly. "I'm sure he's been monitoring you more closely than you realize, looking for signs that you're deviating from the script he's written for you. My presence here confirms that you're building alliances outside his control, and that makes us a threat. That makes you the most dangerous person in the wizarding world," Sirius corrected. "A Harry Potter who thinks for himself, who has allies he trusts more than authority figures, who refuses to sacrifice himself for other people's causes. That's Dumbledore's worst nightmare. So what do? We prepare for war," Sirius said simply. "Because after tonight, there's no going back. Dumbledore will move against you and everyone you care about, and we'd better be ready for it." Harry watched his godfather disappear into the secret passage, then made his way back to Gryffindor Tower through the quiet corridors of the castle. The other students were still asleep, unaware that the balance of power in the wizarding world had just shifted fundamentally. But as Harry slipped into his bed and closed his eyes, he could feel the presence of his allies, Hermione, with her brilliant analytical mind and fierce loyalty, the Circle members, each bringing their own strengths and perspectives, his soul fragment partners, offering knowledge and magical power beyond what most wizards could imagine, and now Sirius, providing adult wisdom and political connections. For the first time since learning the truth about his destiny, Harry felt like he might actually be strong enough to win the war that was coming. The question was whether any of them would survive the victory. Chapter 8. Shadows of War. The Triwizard Tournament was supposed to be Dumbledore's masterpiece of manipulation, Harry realized as he stood in the champion's tent before the first task, surrounded by dragons and the carefully orchestrated chaos that would test his willingness to risk everything for others. The selection of his name from the Goblet of Fire, the binding magical contract that forced his participation, the escalating dangers designed to push him toward greater and greater acts of heroism. It all bore the hallmarks of the old man's careful planning. What Dumbledore hadn't planned for was a Harry Potter who understood the game being played around him. "You don't have to do this," Hermione whispered, as she helped him check the protective charms woven into his tournament robes. They were alone in a side chamber, hidden from the other champions and their supporters by privacy wards that Luna had taught them. "We could expose the whole thing, reveal that your entry was orchestrated." "And then what?" Harry asked, his hands steady as he prepared the specialized equipment Sirius had provided, not the flashy, obvious magical items that Moody had been steering him toward, but subtle tools that would give him genuine advantages. "They'd find another way to put me in danger, another test to measure my heroic instincts. At least this way, I know what's coming. The circle is in position, Draco said quietly from where he stood, watch near the tent entrance. If anything goes wrong, if this turns out to be more than just a dragon, we're ready. Harry nodded, feeling the familiar weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. The circle had grown to nearly 30 members across all 4 houses, each carefully selected for their intelligence, their moral courage, and their ability to see through the lies they had been fed their entire lives. They were positioned throughout the stands, watching not just for his safety, but for signs that today's events were serving purposes beyond simple tournament entertainment. Remember, Harry said, looking each of his closest allies in the eye. We're not just trying to survive this. We're trying to learn from it. Every spell cast, every decision made, every reaction from the judges, it's all information we can use to understand what they're really planning. The Hungarian Horntail was magnificent and terrifying, exactly the kind of opponent that would require a young wizard to choose between his own safety and some greater good. But Harry approached the task with a clinical precision that seemed to surprise everyone watching. Instead of the desperate, instinct-driven response they had expected, he demonstrated a level of tactical thinking and magical control that suggested extensive preparation and adult guidance. He retrieved the golden egg, not through reckless bravery, but through careful analysis of dragon behavior, strategic use of misdirection, and the application of advanced defensive magic that most 7th years would have struggled to master. The crowd cheered his success, but Harry could see the calculating looks on the judges' faces, the careful notation of his methods and capabilities. Most telling of all was Dumbledore's expression, not pride or relief, but something that looked almost like concern. That was not the performance of someone who acts on noble instinct, Severus Snape observed later that evening, when Harry encountered him in an empty corridor near the potions classroom. That was the performance of someone who has been extensively trained in combat magic and tactical thinking. Harry stopped walking, but didn't turn around. Is there something wrong with being prepared, Professor? That depends on who prepared you, and for what purpose. Snape's voice carried its usual silken menace, but there was something else beneath it. Curiosity, perhaps even concern. Tell me, Potter, who has been teaching you to fight like a seasoned aura rather than a 14-year-old boy? People who care more about keeping me alive than about testing my character, Harry replied, finally turning to face his professor. People who think I deserve to survive my challenges rather than die nobly attempting at them. Something shifted in Snape's expression at those words. For just a moment, the mask of cold professionalism slipped, revealing something raw and vulnerable beneath. And what? Snape asked carefully. Do you know about the difference between those who would preserve your life and those who would preserve your legend? It was the closest thing to a direct question about loyalties that Snape had ever asked him. Harry studied the man's face, looking for signs of the complex motivations he had come to understand drove his most enigmatic professor. I know that some people loved my mother enough to spend 14 years protecting her son, Harry said quietly, and I know that those people might be willing to consider alternatives to the path that's been chosen for me, if they believed such alternatives existed. Snape was very still for a long moment, his black eyes searching Harry's face as if trying to read his thoughts. Alternatives, he repeated slowly. And what alternatives might those be, Potter? The kind that honor my mother's sacrifice, by ensuring her son has a chance to live the life she died protecting, rather than following her example by dying young for someone else's cause. The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken understanding. When Snape finally spoke again, his voice was barely above a whisper. Your mother, he said, believed that love was stronger than destiny. She believed that the future could be changed through will and sacrifice, and the refusal to accept that any death was inevitable. Did she ever tell you what she thought I should become? Harry asked. She thought you should become whatever you chose to become, Snape replied. She thought you should have the freedom to make your own mistakes and achieve your own victories. She thought. He paused, seeming to struggle with some internal decision. She thought you should never have to die for other people's failures. Then maybe, Harry said carefully, we want the same thing. Perhaps we do. Snape studied him for another long moment, then nodded almost imperceptibly. I will consider your alternatives, Potter, should you develop any that seem viable. He swept away into the darkness, leaving Harry standing alone in the corridor, with the knowledge that he had just gained another ally, possibly the most dangerous and valuable one yet. The second task confirmed Harry's suspicions about the tournament's true purpose. The challenge was designed to test not just his magical abilities, but his willingness to risk everything to save others, even when those others were hostages whose danger existed solely because of his participation in the tournament. It was a perfect microcosm of the larger game being played around him, innocent people placed in danger so that Harry could prove his heroic character by saving them. But this time, Harry was prepared. The Circle had spent weeks researching underwater environments, developing magical techniques for extended submersion, and planning contingencies for rescue operations in hostile conditions. When Harry dove into the lake, he wasn't a desperate boy hoping his instincts would carry him through. He was a trained operative executing a carefully planned mission. More importantly, he wasn't alone. Luna and Neville were positioned around the lake's perimeter, using enhanced scrying techniques to monitor his progress and ready to provide magical support if needed. Hermione and Draco were in the stands with communication mirrors, coordinating with the rest of the Circle to ensure that any unexpected complications could be addressed immediately. And in the depths of the lake, as Harry freed not just Ron but all 4 hostages from their magical bonds, he was guided by the knowledge and magical strength of his allied soul fragments. The presence of Tom Riddle's memories, filtered through years of learning to value human life over abstract principles, gave him an understanding of underwater magic that no 4th-year student should have possessed. He surfaced with all 4 hostages alive and unharmed, having completed the task with an efficiency that left the judges scrambling to score a performance that bore no resemblance to what they had expected. Interesting approach, Barty Crouch Jr. said to him afterward, still disguised as Mad-Eye Moody but unable to hide his genuine surprise. Very thorough. I don't like leaving people behind, Harry replied simply, but his eyes held a challenge that the disguised Death Eater seemed to recognize. The third task was where everything went wrong, not for Harry, but for Dumbledore's plans. The maze was supposed to isolate Harry from potential help, forcing him to rely on his own instincts and moral character when faced with the tournament's final challenge. The Triwizard Cup was supposed to be a portkey that would deliver him directly into Voldemort's hands, alone and unprepared for what awaited him. What actually happened was that Harry entered the maze with a 2-way mirror connected to Sirius, magical tracking beacons that would allow the Circle to locate him anywhere on the grounds, and a clear understanding that the tournament's finale was almost certainly a trap. When he reached the center of the maze and saw the cup sitting unguarded, Harry didn't touch it. Instead, he activated the emergency beacon that brought Sirius, Snape, and half the Circle converging on his location within minutes. "Portkey," Snape confirmed after examining the cup with diagnostic spells. "Destination unknown, but the magical signature suggests it was created recently and with significant dark magic." "So someone wanted me to grab the cup and be transported somewhere," Harry said, his voice calm despite the adrenaline coursing through his system. "The question is whether we let that happen on our terms or theirs." "We don't let it happen at all," Sirius said firmly. "Whatever they have planned, we can disrupt it by changing the variables." "No," Harry said, surprising everyone present. "We let it happen, but we make sure I'm not alone when it does." What followed was the most carefully planned ambush in recent wizarding history. When Harry finally grasped the Triwizard Cup, he was accompanied by Sirius, Snape, and 3 of the most tactically minded circle members, all of them prepared for combat, and linked by communication charms that would allow coordination even under the most chaotic circumstances. They arrived in Little Hangleton's graveyard to find Voldemort's resurrection ritual already in progress, Wormtail standing over a cauldron with a grotesque, infant-like form cradled in his arms. But instead of the terrified, isolated boy they had expected, they were confronted by a well-prepared strike team that immediately took defensive positions and began systematically dismantling their carefully laid plans. "Impossible," Voldemort said, when the ritual was complete and he emerged from the cauldron in his restored body, red eyes blazing with fury and confusion. "You should be alone. You should be helpless." "I was alone for 11 years, Harry replied, his voice carrying harmonics that belonged to more than one soul. "I was helpless for 11 years. I decided I didn't like it." The battle that followed was nothing like the duel Voldemort had planned. Instead of a symbolic confrontation between the Dark Lord and the boy who lived, it was a tactical engagement between an overconfident megalomaniac and a coordinated team that had spent months preparing for exactly this scenario. Voldemort's Death Eaters found themselves facing opponents who knew their weaknesses, who had studied their fighting styles, who could counter their favorite curses and exploit their psychological vulnerabilities. Sirius engaged Wormtail with the focused fury of someone who had spent 12 years in Azkaban dreaming of this moment. Snape moved through the battlefield like a dark angel, his loyalties finally clear as he systematically disabled Death Eaters who had once called him brother. And Harry himself faced Voldemort not as a teenager overwhelmed by his destiny, but as someone who had learned to integrate the knowledge and power of 3 souls into a single, formidable will. "You think you can defeat me with preparation and allies?" Voldemort snarled as their spells clashed in showers of light and force. "I am Lord Voldemort. I have conquered death itself." "You've conquered nothing," Harry replied, his magic flowing through channels that his allied soul fragments had taught him to access. "You've destroyed your ability to grow, to learn, to become anything more than what you already were. You've made yourself into a static echo of your 15-year-old self's fears and ambitions. And what have you made yourself into? Something you never could be," Harry said simply. "Someone who chooses love over fear, growth over stagnation, connection over isolation. Someone who learned that strength comes from synthesis, not domination." The confrontation ended not with Harry's death or Voldemort's victory, but with the Dark Lord's strategic withdrawal in the face of opponents he had never expected to encounter. He escaped, wounded and furious, leaving behind several captured Death Eaters and the shattered remnants of his carefully planned return to power. But the real war began when they returned to Hogwarts. Dumbledore was waiting for them in his office, his expression more dangerous than Harry had ever seen it. Gone was any pretense of grandfatherly concern or benevolent guidance. This was the man who had defeated Grindelwald, the wizard who had shaped the politics of the magical world for decades, and he was furious. "You have destroyed everything," he said quietly, as Harry, Sirius, and Snape faced him across his desk. 15 years of careful planning, undone by childish rebellion and misguided arrogance. "We've prevented the death of an innocent boy," Sirius replied coldly. "We've protected Harry from the trap you helped set for him." "Harry was never meant to die in that graveyard," Dumbledore said, his blue eyes blazing with controlled anger. "He was meant to learn. He was meant to understand the scope of the sacrifice that would eventually be required of him. You have robbed him of that understanding and doomed thousands to die in a war that could have been ended tonight." "By sacrificing me," Harry said quietly. "By letting Voldemort kill me, so that the Horcrux in my head would be destroyed." "By allowing you to make the choice that your parents made," Dumbledore corrected. "The choice to value others' lives above your own, to accept death in service of life, to prove that love is stronger than death." "Love doesn't require death," Harry said firmly. "My parents' love protected me, not because they died, but because they chose to value my life above their own safety. I can honor that love by living, By protecting others. By building a world where such sacrifices aren't necessary. You speak like a child who has never seen the true face of war, Dumbledore said with bitter sadness. Like someone who believes that noble intentions can overcome the brutal realities of power and politics. I speak like someone who's tired of letting old men make decisions about young people's deaths, Harry replied, like someone who thinks it's time for my generation to try a different approach. And what approach is that, Harry? What do you think you can accomplish that centuries of wizards before you could not? We can choose cooperation over domination, Harry said simply. We can choose healing over destruction. We can choose to redeem our enemies instead of just defeating them. Redeem them? Dumbledore's voice was sharp with disbelief. You think Voldemort can be redeemed? You think the Death Eaters can be reasoned with? I think Tom Riddle was a 15-year-old boy who was failed by every adult who should have protected and guided him, Harry said quietly. I think he became a monster because no one ever offered him a path to become anything else. And I think that if we can offer that path now, if we can show him that there are alternatives to the cycle of violence and domination— You think you can save everyone? Dumbledore interrupted, his voice heavy with the weight of decades of compromise and loss. You think that because you are young and idealistic, you can accomplish what seasoned warriors and wise leaders could not. But the world does not work that way. Harry, sometimes good people must die so that better people can live. Sometimes sacrifices must be made for the greater good. And who decides? Harry asked, rising from his chair to face Dumbledore directly. Who gets to choose which lives matter and which ones don't? Who has the right to sacrifice other people's children for abstract concepts like the greater good? Those who have the wisdom to see beyond their own immediate interests, Dumbledore replied. Those who understand that individual desires must sometimes be subordinated to collective needs. Those who have convinced themselves that their vision of the future justifies any present cruelty, Harry countered. Those who have forgotten that the greatest good is respecting every individual's right to choose their own destiny. They stood facing each other across the office, and Harry could feel the exact moment when whatever remained of their relationship finally shattered. Dumbledore looked at him with the expression of someone watching a promising student reveal themselves to be irrevocably lost to error and foolishness. I see that we have reached an impasse, Dumbledore said finally. You have chosen to reject the guidance of those who love you in favor of the flattery of those who would use your nobility against you. I've chosen to trust the people who see me as a person rather than a symbol, Harry corrected. I've chosen to listen to those who want me to live, rather than those who want me to die memorably. Very well. Dumbledore's voice was cold and final. But understand this, Harry Potter, your choices have consequences beyond yourself. When Voldemort returns, when the war begins in earnest, when innocent people die because you refuse to make the sacrifice that would have ended his threat permanently, their blood will be on your hands. And when we find another way, Harry said quietly, when we save the people you would have sacrificed, when we build a world based on redemption rather than retribution, their lives will be our vindication. Harry left Dumbledore's office that night with the knowledge that he was now officially at war with one of the most powerful wizards alive. The man who had controlled his life from birth, who had shaped the wizarding world's response to dark magic for decades, was now his enemy. But as he made his way back to Gryffindor Tower, Harry felt something he had never experienced before: complete certainty about his own moral position. For the first time in his life, he was fighting for something he believed in, rather than against something others had told him to fear. The question was whether that would be enough to survive what was coming. The Ministry's response to Voldemort's return was exactly what Harry had expected: denial, cover-up, and a determined refusal to acknowledge any reality that would require them to take action or accept responsibility. Minister Fudge declared the entire graveyard incident a hoax perpetrated by attention-seeking teenagers and ambitious opportunists. The Daily Prophet launched a campaign to discredit Harry, Sirius, and anyone else who claimed that the Dark Lord had returned. But this time, Harry was prepared for the propaganda war. The Circle had spent months building networks of communication outside official channels. They had allies in every house, contacts in multiple magical families, and most importantly, they had credible adult witnesses to corroborate their account of events. When the Ministry tried to silence them, they had already documented everything. When the Prophet tried to discredit them, they had alternative sources of information ready to share the truth. "The beautiful thing about their denial," Hermione said, as they met in the room of requirement to plan their response to the latest round of attacks, "is that it creates a power vacuum. People know something is wrong, but the official authorities are telling them to ignore the evidence of their own eyes. That creates an opportunity for alternative leadership." "Alternative leadership," Luna repeated thoughtfully. "Like a group of young people who have proven they can work together across house lines, who have demonstrated competence in dangerous situations, who offer practical solutions rather than just empty reassurances." "Exactly," Harry said. "We can't force people to believe us, but we can show them that we're taking the threat seriously. We can offer protection, training, and honest information to anyone who wants it." The Circle's growth accelerated dramatically over the following months. Students who had dismissed them as paranoid rebels found themselves seeking out their training sessions when strange incidents began occurring around the country. Families who had initially trusted the Ministry's denials started attending the information sessions that Circle members organized in Diagon Alley and Hogsmeade. Most significantly, adult witches and wizards began reaching out to offer their support and expertise. McGonagall was the first, officially resigning her position as deputy headmistress to protest Dumbledore's dangerous prioritization of abstract principles over student welfare. She was followed by half the Hogwarts faculty, 3 members of the Wizengamot, and dozens of Aurors who had grown frustrated with the Ministry's refusal to take action against credible threats. "We're not trying to overthrow the government," Harry explained to a gathering of nearly 200 witches and wizards in the Great Hall one evening in February. "We're trying to fill the gaps that their denial has created. We're trying to protect people who deserve protection and give them information they need to make informed decisions about their own safety." "And what about Dumbledore?" asked Augusta Longbottom, Neville's formidable grandmother. "What about his supporters who claim that you're undermining the unity we need to face this threat?" "Dumbledore is welcome to join our efforts," Harry replied. "We've never tried to exclude anyone who genuinely wants to protect innocent people. But we won't submit to leadership that sees some lives as acceptable losses for strategic purposes. We won't pretend that noble intentions justify any sacrifice demanded of others." The confrontation that everyone had been anticipating finally came in June, when Dumbledore arrived at the meeting hall with a dozen members of the Order of the Phoenix and demanded that Harry's unauthorized organization disband immediately. "You are children playing at war," he declared, his voice carrying the authority of decades of leadership. "You are endangering lives through inexperience and reckless idealism. This ends now." "No," Harry said simply, rising from his seat at the head of the assembled group. "It doesn't." The magical tension in the room was palpable as the two groups faced each other. On one side stood Dumbledore and his followers, experienced fighters who had been shaped by decades of conflict with dark wizards. On the other stood Harry's coalition, younger, more diverse, but united by principles that they had chosen rather than inherited. "Harry," Dumbledore said, his voice heavy with disappointment and regret, "this is your last chance to step back from a path that can only lead to disaster. Submit to proper authority. Accept the guidance of those who understand the complexities of war, and I will ensure that your followers are forgiven for their misguided loyalty. And if we refuse, then you will be treated as what you have become, a threat to the safety and stability of the wizarding world. Your organization will be disbanded by force, your members arrested for sedition, and you yourself will be confined until such time as you can be trusted not to endanger others through your rebellion." Harry looked around the room at the faces of the people who had chosen to follow him. Students and adults, pure-bloods and muggle-borns, former enemies who had become allies through shared commitment to principles that valued every life equally. They were looking at him with trust and determination, ready to fight for the world they wanted to build, rather than accept the one they had inherited. "Then we refuse," Harry said quietly, and felt the weight of leadership settle on his shoulders like a mantle of responsibility that he had finally learned to wear. The battle that followed was brief but decisive. Dumbledore's followers were skilled and experienced, but they were also fighting to preserve a system that had already failed too many people. Harry's coalition fought with the desperation of those who knew that defeat meant not just their own destruction, but the continuation of a cycle of manipulation and sacrifice that had already cost too much. When the dust settled, Dumbledore lay unconscious on the floor, his supporters either defeated or fled, and Harry Potter stood as the acknowledged leader of a new order that promised protection without requiring worship, leadership without demanding blind obedience. But as Harry looked down at the man who had shaped his entire life, he felt no triumph, only sadness for the future that might have been possible if Dumbledore had learned to trust others with the burden of choice. The real war was just beginning, and Harry was no longer fighting just for his own freedom, but for the right of every person to write their own destiny. The question was whether he was strong enough to lead them all to victory. Chapter 9. The Price of Independence. The first sign that everything was falling apart came on a Tuesday morning in late September, when Hannah Abbott simply didn't show up for their scheduled circle meeting. Hannah was nothing if not punctual. Her Hufflepuff sensibilities meant she was usually the first to arrive and the last to leave, armed with carefully organized notes and practical suggestions that kept their discussions grounded in reality. Harry stared at the empty chair where she should have been sitting, a cold dread settling in his stomach that had nothing to do with the autumn chill seeping through the Room of Requirement's walls. "When did anyone last see her?" he asked the assembled group, though the grim expressions on their faces already suggested the answer. "Sunday dinner," Susan Bones said quietly, her voice tight with worry. She seemed nervous, kept looking over her shoulder. Said she thought someone had been following her. "Following her where?" Hermione asked, pulling out the communication notebook they used to track member safety and activities. "Between classes, to and from the library, even to the bathroom." Susan's hands were trembling slightly as she spoke. "I offered to walk with her, but she said she didn't want to put me in danger too." The silence that followed was heavy with the weight of understanding. They had all known this moment would come eventually, the moment when their opposition to both Voldemort's violence and Dumbledore's manipulation would provoke retaliation. But knowing something intellectually was very different from facing its reality. "It could be either side," Draco observed, his voice carefully neutral, but his grey eyes sharp with calculation. "The Ministry, what's left of the Order, Death Eaters, any of them would see value in targeting our most vulnerable members." "Hannah isn't vulnerable," Neville said with surprising firmness. "She's careful, she's smart, and she's been learning defensive magic from the best of us. If someone took her, it's because they had overwhelming force or inside information." The implication hung in the air like a curse. Someone with access to their plans and schedules had betrayed them, had provided their enemies with the intelligence needed to strike at exactly the right moment. "We need to assume operational security has been compromised," Harry said, his mind already shifting into the tactical thinking mode that his allied soul fragments had taught him. "We need to change all our meeting locations, communication protocols, and contact schedules. And we need to find Hannah before—" "Before what?" Luna asked in her characteristically direct way. "Before they torture her for information. Before they kill her to send us a message. Before they use her as bait to draw you into a trap." Each possibility was worse than the last, but Luna's blunt assessment forced them to confront the reality of their situation. They were no longer playing at revolution. They were in an actual war with actual consequences, and people they cared about were paying the price. All of the above, Harry said grimly, which means we need to move fast and smart. Hermione, can you trace the last known location from her communication mirror? Already on it, Hermione replied, her fingers dancing over the complex detection charms she had been developing. But Harry, the signal went dead yesterday evening around 8 o'clock. If they took her then, they've had almost 18 hours to extract whatever information they wanted. Then we assume they know everything she knew, Harry said. We assume our safe houses are compromised, our backup plans are known, our allies are being watched. We go to full operational security starting now. The next hour was a carefully controlled chaos of emergency protocols being activated. Members who lived in vulnerable locations were moved to safe houses that Hannah had never known about. Communication codes were changed to new patterns that relied on pre-arranged signals rather than the mirrors that might have been compromised. Most importantly, the Circle's most sensitive information, the location of their research archives, the identities of their adult allies, the details of Harry's planned approach to the remaining Horcruxes, was secured using memory charms and encrypted storage that would take weeks to break even under torture. But even as they worked to protect themselves from the immediate threat, Harry knew they were fighting a losing battle. Every security measure they implemented also made them less efficient, less capable of pursuing their larger goals. Every ally they moved to safety was one less person available for active operations. Every precaution they took was a step back from the offensive strategy that had been their greatest strength. "We're being forced into a defensive position," Sirius observed, when Harry briefed him on the situation via emergency communication protocols. "That's exactly what both Dumbledore and Voldemort want, to make us react to their initiatives rather than pursuing our own." "So what do you suggest?" Harry asked, though part of him already knew the answer and dreaded it. "We make them think their strategy is working while we pursue the objectives that matter most," Sirius replied. "We give them some of what they want: visible retreats, apparent panic, evidence that we're struggling to maintain cohesion, while the core team focuses on finding and dealing with the Horcruxes." "That means sacrificing some of our allies," Harry said quietly. "It means letting some of our people take risks while we pursue our own agenda. It means accepting that leadership requires making impossible choices," Sirius corrected, his voice gentle but implacable. "It means understanding that sometimes protecting the mission is more important than protecting every individual involved in it." Harry closed his eyes and felt the weight of command settling on his shoulders like a physical burden. This was what Dumbledore had been trying to teach him, in his own twisted way, that leaders had to be willing to sacrifice others for larger purposes. The difference was that Harry was making these choices himself, with full knowledge of their cost, rather than having them imposed by someone else's vision of the greater good. "I hate this," Harry said. "Good," Sirius replied firmly. "The day you stop hating these choices is the day you become the kind of leader who shouldn't be trusted with other people's lives." The decision to split their efforts came after 3 more Circle members vanished over the following week. Dean Thomas disappeared from a Quidditch practice session. Zacharias Smith was taken from his dormitory in the middle of the night. Most devastating of all, Susan Bones, who had been Hannah's closest friend and one of their most reliable sources of Ministry intelligence, simply failed to return from what should have been a routine trip to Diagon Alley. Each disappearance followed the same pattern: sudden, professional, and seemingly impossible to prevent, despite all their precautions. It was clear that someone with intimate knowledge of their operations was feeding information to their enemies, but the identity of the traitor remained frustratingly elusive. "It has to be someone with access to everything," Hermione said, as they huddled in their new safe house, an abandoned cottage in the Scottish Highlands that Sirius had inherited, along with the Black family properties. "Someone who knows our schedules, our safe houses, our communication protocols. That describes almost everyone in the core leadership, Draco pointed out grimly. Any of us could be the leak, either voluntarily or under compulsion. Not any of us, Luna said with her characteristic certainty. I can see the rackspurts around people who are being dishonest or controlled. None of the people in this room have them. Which means either the traitor isn't among the core group, or they're being fed information by someone who is, Harry concluded. Either way, we can't keep operating the way we have been. We need to compartmentalize, limit information flow, and assume that everything we do will be reported to our enemies. The solution they developed was both elegant and heartbreaking. The circle would continue to operate, but in isolated cells that knew nothing about each other's activities. Each cell would be given a specific mission, some real, some elaborate deceptions designed to waste their enemies' time and resources. Only the core group would know which operations mattered and which were distractions. It's brutal, Hermione said, as they finalized the plans. We're essentially abandoning most of our allies to serve as unwitting decoys. We're giving them a chance to survive while we end this war, Harry corrected, though the distinction felt hollow even as he spoke. If we succeed in destroying the remaining Horcruxes and dealing with Voldemort, none of the other operations will matter. If we fail, it won't matter how many cells we have or how well they're hidden. The core group that would pursue the Horcruxes was necessarily small. Harry, Hermione, Neville, Luna, Draco, and Ginny, with Sirius and Snape providing adult support from outside Hogwarts. Everyone else, no matter how trusted or capable, was relegated to decoy operations or defensive positions. It was the hardest decision Harry had ever made, and it felt like a betrayal of everything the Circle was supposed to represent. But as they began their hunt for the remaining Horcruxes, Harry found himself drawing on resources he had never expected to rely upon. His allied soul fragments, the pieces of Tom Riddle that had chosen growth over stagnation, redemption over domination, proved invaluable in understanding how Voldemort's mind worked, and where he might have hidden pieces of his soul. He would have chosen places that meant something to him, the diary fragment said during one of their evening planning sessions. Harry had learned to manifest both fragments visibly when privacy charms ensured they wouldn't be observed by others. Not just secure locations, but places that fed his ego, that reminded him of his power and importance. But he also would have been practical, Harry's original Horcrux added. He understood that sentiment was a weakness that could be exploited, so he would have balanced emotional significance with strategic defensibility. The cave where he tormented the other children from the orphanage, Hermione said, consulting her notes on Voldemort's history. The Gaunt family hovel, where he learned about his magical heritage. Hogwarts itself, the first place he felt truly powerful. And objects that represented his conquest of death, Harry added, feeling the fragment's memories stirring with recognition.